The Vatican's most feared text isn't simply banned. No one speaks its name, not even among the highest clergy. Buried within secured chambers, this volume terrified even the most powerful priests. Wrapped in quiet and locked behind iron barriers, whispers suggest it holds more than mere words. Some describe it as a tale woven in darkness. Others think it could reshape the church completely. Rumours claim it was concealed not for being untrue, but for perhaps being too real. If mysteries like this intrigue you, remember to subscribe for more content. Now shut your eyes and let this enigma unfold. It starts not with noise, but with the sense that truth is being withheld from you. Within Vatican City's core, between marble corridors and golden radiance, exists a quiet that doesn't stem from tranquility. It's the quiet of something imprisoned, something anticipating. Visitors traverse St. Peter's Basilica's stone floors daily. They pray on their knees. They murmur devotions. Yet few realize what rests below them. And even fewer have encountered the tale of a volume the Church refuses to acknowledge. Not through neglect, but through deliberate concealment. The Vatican houses one of Earth's most clandestine libraries. They name it the Apostolic Archive. Though sections open to select researchers, the crucial areas remain sealed. Hidden in this archive stands a chamber beyond 3 iron barriers, windowless, unmarked. Just a key possessed by a chosen few trusted individuals. Here, quiet accounts suggest, a solitary volume was stored long ago. A volume without equal. No formal name exists. No writer is credited, yet supposedly it contains something so disturbing the Vatican elected not to eliminate it, only to seal it permanently. Some claim it emerged from a distant monastery. Others think it descended from ages predating the Church. Nobody agrees when this volume first entered the Vatican. Yet those professing knowledge of its history share identical dread. Not obvious dread. Not the variety spreading through masses, but a gradual, profound dread, the type making even courageous individuals speak softly. What troubles them isn't solely the written content. It's how the language appears to extend beyond paper, as though the narrative within remains incomplete, as though it continues observing. Several permitted to examine it years past never mentioned it afterward. One abandoned the church. Another disappeared entirely. Official documentation doesn't exist, only rumours transferred between generations. Yet what truly defines this volume? Some think it preserves a lost gospel. Others claim it forecasts unrealised events. Some consider it a compilation of ceremonies too hazardous for utterance. Certainty eludes us. However, we know the Vatican didn't incinerate it. They preserved it, and that decision, maintaining something so feared, so concealed, might constitute the ultimate riddle. If these words weren't intended for reading, why safeguard them whatsoever? The solution possibly waits just past the following entrance, and tonight we'll pursue it. The entrance seemed unremarkable, constructed from timber, aged and weathered, positioned in the stone barrier like countless others throughout the Apostolic Palace. No marking, no numeral, no identification revealing what waited beyond. Most individuals passed without hesitation, yet Vatican workers understood differently. Beyond this entrance lay a chamber absent from public maps, and within that chamber, the atmosphere carried the burden of something ancient. They claim it lacks a lock, though it functions identically. Only select individuals gain entry. Several sworn archivists, all pledged to secrecy. Photographs are forbidden. Written records cannot depart. And once someone crosses the threshold, they seldom discuss it subsequently. The chamber itself maintains silence. Not merely stillness is silence, but the deeper silence filling locations where time appears suspended. Shelves align the barriers, though not as anticipated. Most shelves stand vacant, not dusty, not abandoned, simply waiting. One table occupies the centre, bearing nothing. No volume, no documents, only polished stone beneath gentle illumination. It's termed the empty chamber. That's not its actual designation, yet it's the sole name people risk using. So why maintain such a chamber? Why protect a location holding no documentation, no files, no evidence? That question has mystified even the rare witnesses. Some think the chamber once facilitated reading hazardous texts, stationed there ensuring the volume never departed. Others suggest it's a concealment space where items arrive discreetly and vanish without evidence. One whispered account describes a solitary volume remaining there numerous years, positioned on the central table like a dormant creature, not restrained, not supervised, simply abandoned in silence as though the chamber sufficed. Nobody knows when the volume was removed or whether it truly existed there. Yet in the chamber's corner, concealed in shadow, exists a floor marking, a small dark impression in the stone as though something substantial had once remained there extensively. It might signify nothing or represent the sole remaining trace. No forced entry signs, no destruction, no documentation. Yet sometimes absence communicates the clearest narrative. The Vatican represents knowledge, history, devotion. Yet here, in this silent space, it preserves something else. A riddle constructed not from visibility, but from careful elimination. What once occupied this chamber, what created that silent impression, remains unspoken. Yet the trail it creates draws us deeper, and we're only beginning. Numerous words resonate inside the Vatican, prayer words, guidance words, words reverberating through magnificent halls and silent sanctuaries. Yet one word they don't speak. Not publicly, not in teachings, not even within their secure quarters. It's a volume's name, a text that for centuries existed solely through whispers and cautions. Among the trusted few, labouring deep within the Vatican's archives, an understanding exists. Certain volumes simply aren't meant for reading. They're handled with protective coverings, with silence, and with the attention given hazardous objects. These texts don't feature on library registers or public exhibitions. Their names are excluded from official documentation, and the most feared among them is the one nobody ventures naming aloud. Long ago, the Church compiled a register called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. In Latin, it signifies the Index of Forbidden Books. It debuted in 1559. The objective was shielding the faithful from concepts potentially leading them astray. Through the years, the register expanded. Volumes on science, philosophy, mysticism and theology were included. Some were prohibited for challenging church power, others for describing inexplicable phenomena. Yet even on that extensive forbidden works register, several stood distinct. These weren't merely spiritually dangerous, the Church maintained, but structurally threatening to belief itself. These volumes were concealed, not destroyed, secured, examined solely by limited chosen observers. And among these, one volume became a phantom. The Vatican never published its designation. It never documented its creator. It was referenced solely by a code, a shelf identification that shifted periodically. Yet even that identification now disappears from documentation. Some term it the manuscript of fear. Others reference it solely as the silence. Supposedly it contains concepts so ancient, so peculiar, that even extensively trained scholars struggled comprehending it. A volume discussing pre-creation matters, of voices summoning humanity before initial church bells sounded. Nobody knows whether the volume survives, or whether it was quietly eliminated, entombed within a barrier, or incinerated without documentation. Yet the dread it previously caused persists. It left beyond mere vacant space. It left behind a kind of discomfort, as though concealing it could never completely eliminate its existence. Inside the Vatican, quiet isn't invariably peaceful. Sometimes it's a caution. An unspoken word can resonate louder than any cry. And the further we advance into these narratives, the more we sense it. The dread isn't solely in the volume's content, it's in what it makes individuals recall or challenge. And the word they never speak remains anticipating. In the Vatican's silent core exists a register that once influenced millions of minds, not a register of saints or devotions, but of peril. It was termed the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the index of forbidden volumes. To most, it resembles something from ancient tales, yet for over 4 centuries it was authentic and formidable. The index debuted in 1559. It wasn't created secretly. It was printed and distributed to bishops, clergy, and even citizens. The message was transparent. These were volumes the faithful couldn't read. Some names were renowned, others were peculiar and obscure, yet they shared one commonality. They were perceived as threats to church teachings. Initially, the register was brief, yet eventually it grew. New volumes were authored, new concepts emerged, and the church responded with additional prohibited names. Some works were scientific, like those asserting Earth orbited the Sun. Others were writings on governance, mysticism, or even romance if they diverged excessively from moral standards. By 1966, the register had accumulated thousands of entries. For many, this register was a protective barrier. The Church maintained it was defending truth, protecting people from confusion or falsehoods. Yet for others, the index became a symbol of dread, representing something deeper. Because what significance does it hold when concepts must be concealed, when narratives must be suppressed? Some index volumes later became elements of history's greatest revelations. Galileo's writings were once prohibited. Likewise, many fictional works we currently study academically. Yet not every index volume was released again. Several were never eliminated. Their names vanished from subsequent versions of the register, not because they were cleared, but because they were buried more profoundly. In the Vatican archive's secret corners exist handwritten annotations never reaching the printed index. These were confidential cautions maintained between cardinals and trusted scholars. Annotations stating simply, "Do not read or maintain sealed." Some volumes weren't even identified by name, only by position. The index officially concluded in 1966, yet, even presently, its essence endures. The Church no longer prohibits volumes identically, yet the archives still preserve once-feared texts, and not all have been accessed. Some claim the index was a chart not solely of peril, but of curiosity, because frequently, the more you attempt concealing something, the more it demands discovery. And among those aged pages, one volume might still be anticipating. Not solely forbidden, but forgotten intentionally. A designation never printed, a voice never suppressed. A mystery maintained just beyond grasp. In the Vatican Archive's aged paper documentation, most entries are easily comprehended. Each item has a designation, a shelf identification, and a brief annotation explaining its nature. Some are marked with dates, others with cautions. Yet inserted between these routine records is one peculiar entry. It's written in meticulous Latin like the remainder, yet this one distinguishes itself. Manuscript 451b. No designation, no creator, no subject. Simply the numeral, followed by a vacant space where the description should appear. Nobody knows why it was entered thus or who initially documented it. All that's known is the line has remained undisturbed for numerous years. For the select scholars permitted into restricted sections, this entry has become something resembling a silent puzzle. Most walk past without hesitation, yet those taking time to examine closer begin questioning. Why would the Vatican maintain documentation of something without specifying its nature? A manuscript typically means a handwritten work. Sometimes it's correspondence, sometimes it's a volume. Yet 451b has no specifications, no documentation of its dimensions, its language, or its state. No duplicate of it is found in any catalogue, and nobody has successfully located it on shelves. Some think it never existed, that the numeral was an error or a forgotten placeholder, yet the line's composition, so precise, so clear, makes that improbable. Others claim it was eliminated intentionally after someone examined it and decided it shouldn't be viewed again. A former assistant once asserted he observed the manuscript just once, late at night when he was assisting cleaning one of the smaller archive chambers. He described it as small, bound in faded crimson leather with no markings on the cover. He claimed the pages appeared scorched at edges, though the surrounding air was cold. When he attempted reading the initial page, the letters appeared to shift, as though they resisted comprehension. He was requested to depart the chamber shortly afterward and never observed it again. His account was never verified, yet a notation was discovered years later in a drawer near the archive's rear. It simply stated, "B is not to be touched again. Leave it positioned. Do not name it." Nobody knows who composed the notation, yet it was written in the same ink used for high-level directives, typically those transmitted by bishops. The penmanship was consistent, almost excessively perfect, as though composed by someone who had rehearsed each letter repeatedly. Manuscript 451b remains in the documentation, silent and unexplained. It's the sole entry in its section lacking description, and perhaps that silence is the sole caution we're intended to have, because sometimes what remains vacant communicates more than anything documented in ink. There are numerous entrances inside the Vatican that most individuals will never access. Some lead to magnificent halls filled with gold and radiance. Others go to silent chambers stacked extensively with dusty volumes and deteriorating parchment. Yet occasionally an entrance leads somewhere colder, somewhere deeper. And beyond one of these entrances, a custodian once delivered a caution that still reverberates in the minds of those who heard it. He wasn't a priest, not a scholar, merely a silent individual who kept the keys and swept the archive's floors. He had no position, no vestment, no teachings to deliver, yet he had spent more time in the Vatican's shadowed corners than most would ever venture, and the select individuals who worked alongside him always recalled his words. "Some volumes are secured for a purpose," he stated it quietly, almost like a devotion, as though repeating something he had heard long ago. Nobody ever requested him to clarify the manner he appeared when he stated it was sufficient. A weary expression, a substantial pause like someone who had witnessed something and wished he hadn't. One night years ago, a visiting scholar inquired about a shelf with no identifications. It stood at a corridor's far end, past an entrance with a damaged fastener. The volumes there were aged, bound in substantial covers that appeared excessively heavy for their dimensions. The scholar wanted to know whether he could examine one of them. The custodian didn't yell or dispute. He simply observed the individual, then shook his head. "Not those," he stated. "Not if you want to sleep." Again the inquiry was abandoned, yet the account spread. Not loudly, not in official reports, yet in silent discussions between those who worked late into the night. Eventually, the custodian's words became more than merely a caution. They became a boundary, a line individuals didn't cross. He never stated which volume he meant. He never provided a designation or a numeral. Yet those who knew about manuscript 451b began questioning. Was that the one he feared? Was that the volume that left him silent? Years later, after the custodian had deceased, a notation was discovered tucked behind a shelf in the corner of his aged storage chamber. It was written in a consistent, meticulous hand. The words were sparse. They opened it once. That was sufficient. No designation, no date, no clarification. Simply that line left in the darkness, anticipating being read. Today, that shelf is still there. The volumes still remain in silence, undisturbed. And the key that opens the age entrance, nobody seems to know where it went. Yet maybe that is the intention, because sometimes a lock isn't solely for protection. Sometimes it's a symbol, and those who listen carefully may still hear the custodian's voice, silent and resolute, reminding them of what should remain secured. There is a designation that drifts through the atmosphere like vapour when individuals speak of the Vatican's darkest mysteries. It isn't a saint's designation or a pope's. It is the name of a volume whispered more frequently than spoken. They term it the Grand Grimoire. Others term it the Red Dragon. It's supposedly one of the most feared volumes ever composed, not because it relates a narrative, but because of what it claims to instruct. Some think it preserves rituals, peculiar symbols and aged words meant to summon powers not intended for human possession. Some even claim it contains the actual name of Lucifer, written in faded ink on a damaged page near the beginning. Nobody knows definitively where the volume originated. Some claim it initially appeared in the 15th century. Others claim it's older, significantly older, duplicated from something far more ancient. Narratives connect it to King Solomon, the wise ruler from the Bible, who was supposedly commanded spirits with his language. Whether accurate or not, the volume has always been surrounded by riddle and dread. The Church has never verified the Grand Grimoire's existence, yet that hasn't prevented the rumours. For hundreds of years there have been silent claims that the sole authentic duplicate is concealed within the Vatican's barriers. Secured, guarded, observed by those who don't speak of what they protect. The cover is supposedly a deep crimson, almost the shade of dried blood. No name, no markings. Only a peculiar circle drawn into the leather with 4 letters inside that nobody has successfully translated. Some claim it feels warm to the touch. Others claim the volume grows heavier the longer you possess it. These are accounts told in subdued voices by individuals who know better than to inquire publicly. There have been counterfeits, naturally, duplicates made by curious hands attempting to guess what might be inside. Yet the authentic version, if it exists whatsoever, is never shown, never observed. The Vatican's silence only enhances the riddle. No denial, no statement, simply the same stillness that always surrounds its most secret matters. What makes the Grand Grimoire different is not solely what it might state, it is what it might accomplish. Some think it was composed to control forces beyond our reality. Others claim it is a test, a snare, a volume that turns on the one who attempts to read it. Several even assert it was never intended for individuals whatsoever, that it was duplicated by hand. Yes, yet the words were provided from somewhere else. Nobody can verify these matters. Nobody has possessed the volume and spoken of it afterward. Yet even without verification, the shadow of the Red Dragon still extends through time. And in the Vatican's deep silence, that shadow hasn't diminished. It anticipates unread and very much living. Long before the Vatican existed in Rome, long before the Church as we recognise it was established, narratives were already being related about a king who could command spirits with a ring. His designation was Solomon, and his legend has never diminished. Solomon features in the Bible as a wise and powerful ruler. The son of King David, he constructed the initial temple in Jerusalem and was recognised for his profound knowledge and equitable judgment. Yet outside the Bible, in texts that many term apocryphal or forgotten, there are alternative narratives. Narratives that the Vatican has never completely spoken about, yet has never completely disregarded either. According to these ancient sources, Solomon was not only wise, he was granted control over demons. It's claimed that God provided him a ring with a peculiar seal on it. With this ring, Solomon could summon and command spirits from the unseen realm. These beings, sometimes termed demons and sometimes simply referred to as the 72, were compelled to construct his temple, execute his orders, and even disclose secret knowledge. These narratives don't feature in the regular Bible, yet they exist in aged texts discovered in caves, monasteries, and libraries. One of the most recognised is the Testament of Solomon, a manuscript that was probably composed between the 2nd and 5th centuries. It describes each spirit by designation, by form, and by the powers they possess. Some assume the shape of animals, others speak in peculiar languages. All are registered with meticulous annotations, as though someone wanted to recall precisely how they could be controlled. The Church has never accepted these writings as holy, yet it has not destroyed them either. In reality, duplicates of the Testament of Solomon and similar writings are believed to exist within the Vatican's secret archives. Some researchers have even asserted that these texts were utilized by early church scholars to better comprehend what they termed spiritual warfare. What makes this more than merely myth is the manner it keeps returning. In medieval Europe, volumes known as grimoires, manuals of mysticism, frequently included designations and symbols supposedly originating from Solomon's own writings. And as we've already observed, some think the Grand Grimoire, or the Red Dragon, draws directly from these ancient texts. It's not transparent whether the Vatican fears this knowledge or studies it. Perhaps both. Some whisper that priests assigned with performing exorcisms are trained not solely with scripture, yet with silent, concealed knowledge from long ago. They're taught not only how to pray, yet what to state if something responds. Did Solomon truly command spirits, or did he simply compose what others were excessively afraid to state? Whatever the truth may be, the narrative survived, transferred from hand to hand, duplicated in secret, whispered in stone corridors. And somewhere in the dark stillness of the Vatican archives, the pages still anticipate. Words older than the Church itself, bound not solely in parchment, yet in dread. There is a conviction, silent yet steady, that the most hazardous element of an aged volume is not what is composed in the centre of the page, yet what is concealed in the margins. Tiny annotations, peculiar symbols, marks made by someone who didn't want to be noticed. Regarding specific restricted manuscripts, the markings found within are far more significant than mere casual doodles. They serve as potent cautions, or in a deeper, more unsettling sense, they function as enticements. Deep within the Vatican's guarded compartments are volumes that have not seen the light of day for many decades. Yet when scholars examined them in the distant past, some noticed an odd pattern. In several antique books, particularly those connected to ancient sorcery or ceremonial guidebooks, names were inscribed in the margins, separate from the main narrative. These names appeared only when the light touched the page in a particular manner. One single name was spoken of with greater dread than all the others. It was not voiced openly, not printed, but passed on in low voices among the handful of people who handle these concealed documents. They referred to it as the sign of the morning star. Most people picture a striking, unambiguous symbol, something grand and obvious. But according to the law, the reality was quite the opposite. The emblem was tiny, easily overlooked, a flourish of ink resembling a serpent consuming itself, or occasionally a sequence of characters that made no immediate logical sense. But once someone caught sight of it, they couldn't ignore it, and the moment they made physical contact with the paper, the atmosphere around them would transform. A now deceased former clergyman once recounted the sensation of opening a text rumoured to hold this signature. He claimed the temperature in the room dropped, not sharply but slowly, as though the space itself was withdrawing. The text on the page appeared normal initially, but then he spotted a faint line in the corner, written in a much older style of ink. The script was unlike the rest of the work. It leaned in the wrong direction. The letters possessed unusual tales. He wisely did not read the line out loud. When later questioned about the content, he only responded that it was not intended as a message for him. Many suspect these additions were made by individuals seeking to invoke malign entities, men who believed that writing the genuine name of the disgraced angel could create a passage between realms. Others suggest the marks were a form of selection, placed there to distinguish those who would observe it from those who would simply turn away. The Vatican has consistently avoided confirming the existence of such books. However, It has also never refuted the presence of rituals and names once deemed too volatile to be destroyed. Some were securely locked away, others were copied, intensely studied, and then sealed once more behind metal barriers. Whether the signature is factual or purely mythical is less important than the simple fact that people genuinely believe it exists. That anxiety possesses its own strength, and that conviction has ensured certain pages remain undisturbed for hundreds of years. Some writing fades over time. But this particular ink, they say, was intended to last forever. For generations, people have silently pondered the same question. Can a book genuinely summon evil? Not merely describe it or advise caution against it, but literally open an aperture to a dark force. Within the confines of the Vatican, where belief and knowledge are often inseparable, this inquiry has never been easily resolved. Some dismiss such worries as relics of the past, belonging to a time of ignorance and dread. Others are less certain. There are stories quietly exchanged of scholars granted permission to examine certain ancient documents within the secret archives. These volumes were often composed in obscure tongues, filled with symbols that looked as though they originated from another dimension. Most readers claimed to find nothing out of the ordinary, just obsolete language, folklore, and warnings cloaked in formality. But a few emerged profoundly affected. One Jesuit scholar, trained in both theology and historical languages, once spent 3 days reading a duplicate of an untitled codex linked to the Grand Grimoire. When he returned the volume, he said very little. Yet days later he requested a transfer. He departed from Rome and never came back. He refused to provide an explanation. His final written note simply stated that the document speaks the truth. Was he disturbed by the text he read? Or was it something else entirely, something he could not articulate? The Church has always cautioned against granting spiritual power to objects or writings. It asserts that evil cannot be summoned by mere ink, and that devils do not appear because of symbols or magical words. And yet there have always been discrete exceptions. The mere reality that some volumes are hidden, secured, or accessed only by authorized exorcists implies that the division between a tale and genuine peril is not as distinct as it seems. Some academic experts contend that the fear of inviting evil is based on misinterpretation. They argue that many old rituals were simply attempts to explore the unknown, not true invitations to darkness. They highlight that many grimoires contain Christian prayers alongside strange charts, that these books were produced not by people pursuing evil, but by those seeking mastery over sickness, over anxiety, over mortality. Still others insist that it is not the words by themselves that matter most. It is the conviction behind them. A book alone is merely paper. But a deeply committed reader, one who reads with total purpose, might inadvertently become a conduit for something far more tangible. Whether a book can truly summon evil may never be conclusively demonstrated. However, the Church's decision to restrict certain writings, to hide them in areas few can enter, indicates that even within the domains of logic and holy text, prudence remains a factor. And sometimes prudence is itself a form of faith. Because even if a passage is never intended to be opened, someone, someday, might still locate the necessary key. Concealed deep within the physical structure of Vatican City, there is a corridor most tourists will never encounter. It is narrow, dimly lit, and quieter than a shrine after dark. At the far end of this passage stands a solitary door, unadorned, grey and cool to the touch. But this is not an average door. It is known only to its protectors as the triply locked entrance. The name comes from the way it is secured. 3 separate locking mechanisms, each needing a unique key, must be operated simultaneously. One key is kept by a principal archivist, another by a senior cardinal. And the third, it is rumoured, is handed down only from one pope to the next. Without all 3, the door stays shut, and some believe it has not been opened for many years. The exterior of the door provides no hint of what is behind it. No symbols, no identifying number. Just smooth metal, worn slightly around the edges from hands that once touched it long ago. But those familiar with Vatican history know this location is more than just storage. It is believed to be the access point to one of the most confidential rooms in the church, the place where certain writings, artifacts, and records too hazardous to destroy are kept completely secluded. Very little is understood about the contents behind the door. A few accounts, written in careful Latin and discovered in private correspondence, describe a chamber with no windows and stonework thicker than usual walls. They say it has no electric light switch. Only wax candles are permitted. The air within is chilly and dry, designed to conserve anything placed there. There is no noise, no echoing sound, just the faint smell of aged paper and quiet elapsed time. One visitor, allowed access under highly unusual conditions in the year 1939, described the room in a single sentence. It stores what we both fear and cannot set aside. He never wrote anything further. His identity was subsequently removed from all official registries. What exactly might be stored there? Some suggest it is the definitive copy of the Grand Grimoire. Others believe it is a volume bound in unusual hide with no inscription on the covers, featuring pages that resist decay and words that appear to change as they are read. A few even claim there are scrolls not produced by human hands. These are merely anecdotes, of course, but in a place like this, even anecdotes can feel true. The triply locked entrance is not guarded by armed men. It is protected by time, by silence, and by long-held practice. A form of security created not solely out of fear, but from knowledge. Knowledge that some matters are too powerful, too peculiar, or too true to be handled again. And so the door remains closed, the keys stay separated, and whatever lies inside continues its vigil, undisturbed in the profound quiet of that forbidden room, waiting for someone sufficiently courageous or sufficiently reckless to open it once more. The Vatican's expansive library is world-renowned, but concealed beneath that name is a location even more enigmatic. It is named the Archivum Secretum. In Latin, the term sounds weighty and full of hidden meaning. Many assume it means the secret archive. And for a long time, that concept has captured imaginations. But the word secretum does not exclusively mean hidden. In older Latin, it also means private. The Archivum Secretum was never meant to sound like a repository full of forbidden relics, at least not initially. It was intended to be the personal collection of the Pope, containing his correspondence, his reports, and his own private records. Nonetheless, the mystique around it grew over time. More than 12 centuries of documents came to be housed there. Letters from royal figures and rulers, dispatches from clergy in distant lands, writings on science, political events, and even forbidden beliefs. Some of these papers are benign, simple records of past occurrences. But others recount events the world was not supposed to learn about. For many years, no one outside the Vatican was permitted to view the contents. The Church maintained this was to safeguard the documents from harm. But people began to wonder what kind of knowledge required such careful protection. What truths were being withheld? Even today, a large portion of the archive remains inaccessible to the public. Only credentialed scholars may request entry. They must ask for specific documents, and they are only shown what is provided to them. Cameras are strictly forbidden. Notes are checked and certain collections are never made available at all. Inside the Archivum Secretum are chambers filled with shelves that extend for miles. Some estimate the total length is over 53 miles. That distance is greater than the entire size of Rome itself. There are books with pages crafted from animal hides, containers secured with wax, and scrolls so fragile they must be handled with wooden tools instead of bare hands. A few documents have been released over the years. We now have access to letters from Galileo, reports from the Inquisition, and messages sent during periods of warfare. But for every paper disclosed, there are thousands more kept in obscurity. And among them, it is said, are the texts too hazardous to ever be publicly released. These are not merely personal notes. They are accounts of strange occurrences, unexplained visions, and volumes discovered in locations where no book should logically be. Some believe the archivum maintains a list of prohibited texts removed from public circulation, not destroyed, simply concealed. The name secretum may not imply secret in the sense we initially think, but in the quiet corridors of the Vatican, the distinction feels insignificant. Because what matters most is not the dictionary definition of the word, it is what the word has come to signify in the minds of those who question what realities are still waiting behind those locked doors beneath the Vatican. Far beneath the sunlight warming St. Peter's Square, there is an expanse of shelving unlike any other place on earth. It is quiet, cool, and largely untouched by the passage of time. This is the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Archivum Secretum, and it stores more than just paperwork. It holds the weight of history that has been forgotten. If you were to walk the entire distance without pausing, you would travel over 53 miles. That is longer than the span of the whole city of Rome, but these shelves are not simply for storing old paper. They preserve narratives of faith, anxiety, dominance, and silence. The aroma of ancient parchment hangs in the air. Some shelves are stacked high with rolled documents from the very early period of the church. Others hold leather-bound volumes tied shut with cords that have not been untied in centuries. The temperature is carefully maintained at a low level to safeguard the contents. Lights are subdued, movements are slow, and voices are kept hushed, if anyone speaks at all. Many of the documents were placed here by popes long since deceased. They dispatched letters to monarchs, kept records during periods of conflict, and noted down visions experienced by both holy figures and ordinary people. Some pages are marked with cautions, others are unsigned, their authors unknown, and still others are sealed not only with wax, but with instructions that they must not be read until a certain date. Some of those dates have not yet arrived. What kind of information is buried here? There are birth records, transcripts of legal proceedings, and antique maps, but there are also writings no one discusses publicly. Correspondence detailing unusual phenomena, pages filled with symbols that do not correspond to any known language, books that scholars once studied and then completely stopped mentioning. The shelves bend and stretch through long subterranean passages. Some areas are readily accessible, others are barred behind heavy metal barriers. There are parts where no light penetrates and dust accumulates like fallen snow. These are the locations that provoke the most speculation, not because of what can be seen, but because of what is conspicuously absent. Every so often, a scholar receives authorization to investigate a specific section of the archive. They are given protective gloves, an inventory, and a silent reading station, but they are never shown everything. They are not allowed to wander freely, and no one is permitted to inquire about the restricted areas. The response is always the same. Those shelves are not officially part of the record, but the record is present, just out of reach, waiting quietly. 53 miles of shelving signifies more than just physical space. It signifies secrets accumulated over centuries. It signifies questions without resolution. And it signifies that somewhere deep within that subterranean maze are pages that have not seen light since the day they were first sealed, pages that were never meant to be read again. Yet they remain, dusted over, surrounded by darkness, and closer than we imagine in the profound quiet of the Vatican archives. There is a drawer that holds communications that were never sent. Their paper has yellowed with age. The ink has faded, but the messages still resonate. These were not romantic letters, nor simple messages between acquaintances. These were documents composed during one of the most horrific periods in human history, the years of the Holocaust. The individual who signed the majority of them was Pope Pius XV. He assumed the papacy in the year 1939, just as conflict was spreading across Europe. By that time, many were already aware that terrible things were beginning to take place. Jewish families were being forcibly removed from their residences. Towns were emptied overnight. The world was descending into a period of fear and silence. The Vatican was observing the events, but what it opted to communicate or not to communicate has been debated ever since. Pope Pius XIV had previously worked as a diplomat. He favoured quiet diplomacy, working behind the scenes. Some claim he assisted Jewish families in escaping. Others argue he chose not to speak out forcefully enough. The truth may reside in the letters he never dispatched. Concealed in the archive shelves are preliminary versions of letters addressed to world leaders. Some are directed to high-ranking clergy, some to heads of government. Many of them address the immense suffering of the Jewish population. They describe the necessity for protection, the anguish of keeping silent, and the growing fear when good people do nothing. But the letters were never posted. They stayed within the Vatican, folded, categorized, forgotten, until researchers uncovered them years later. No one knows why they were kept rather than shared. Perhaps Pius worried about escalating the situation. Perhaps he believed that silence offered greater safety. Or perhaps he understood that words once spoken are impossible to retract. One letter, undated but thought to be from the year 1943, concludes with a single line: "To speak now is to expose the entire church to the flames." That statement has been analysed repeatedly. Was it fear? Was it measured prudence? Or was it something else entirely? In subsequent years, some who defended Pius XIV asserted he provided more aid than he was ever credited for, that he worked secretly to save lives. Others still question why he did not raise his voice when the world needed it most. The letters are still there. They sit in silence, mirroring the era from which they came. They do not yell, they do not mourn, but they pose a question that still echoes in the quiet corners of the archive. What is the ultimate cost of remaining silent? The Vatican may never fully answer that, but the paper remains, and the words, despite never being sent, have finally been read. Even in silence, history preserves a record. Tucked away in a small compartment deep within the Vatican archives is a box labelled with a single word: Galileo. Inside are rolled documents, personal notes, and unspoken warnings. Papers that narrate the history of one man's struggle between scientific inquiry and religious doctrine. Galileo Galilei was an astronomer in the early 1600s. He peered through a telescope and observed something that fundamentally altered reality. The Earth, he argued, was not the central point of the cosmos. It orbited the Sun, and not the reverse. This concept was not brand new, but Galileo possessed evidence, and he was prepared to share it globally. The Church was not prepared for this. At that time, the Church taught that the Earth was stationary. Scripture, they maintained, affirmed this. To contest that notion was not just a scientific disagreement. It represented a challenge to faith. When Galileo published his findings, many within the Vatican were concerned. Some feared the impact it would have on believers. Others feared losing their control over the narrative that had defined the Church for generations. So Galileo was summoned to Rome. In the year 1633, he stood before the Inquisition, a body that judged those accused of contradicting Church teachings. He was presented with the scrolls he had authored, asked to clarify his thinking, and instructed to desist. Ultimately, he was found guilty of heresy. The punishment appeared mild, house arrest for the remainder of his life. But the underlying message was undeniable. he was to remain silent. The scrolls were seized, his books were banned, and the Church moved to protect its preferred version of the truth. But the Vatican did not destroy his work. That is the puzzling part. Instead, the scrolls were placed in the archive, locked away, kept intact, yet hidden from view. Researchers who later examined them discovered meticulous notations in the margins, some in Galileo's own handwriting, others added by church officials. One note reads, "He perceives what we are afraid of." Another, "Too much reality, revealed too quickly." Over the centuries, the Church's perspective slowly shifted. Science and scripture began to find common ground once more. In the year 1992, more than 350 years following Galileo's trial, the Vatican finally conceded that its judgment had been flawed. Pope John Paul II spoke of Galileo with respect, stating that faith and reason should never be adversaries. Nevertheless, the scrolls remain behind secured entrances, behind glass, a testament to a time when a new truth appeared and the establishment was unprepared to accept it. Some claim the Church was fearful of the celestial bodies, but perhaps the fear was never about the stars at all. Perhaps it was the realization that the cosmos could be larger than human comprehension, that truth could exist beyond established doctrines, and that once a truth is recognized, it cannot be ignored. Even now, the scrolls quietly relay their story, a story of illumination, of obscurity, and of the long, difficult path between remaining silent and achieving understanding. There is a small, leather-bound book stored deep inside the Vatican archives. It is not printed. Its pages are covered with handwritten observations, scribbled rapidly, as though composed in moments of panic or intense need. The cover is unmarked, no title, no author. But inside, it contains something few people have ever seen: the private diary of a Vatican-certified exorcist. The Church authorizes only a small number of priests for this specific work. They are selected with great care, instructed in the necessary rituals, and warned about the nature of the challenge they will face. Their work is never mentioned in religious sermons. It is never made public. But it occurs quietly, in private settings. This diary is believed to have belonged to a priest who performed this duty in the mid-1900s. He primarily operated in Italy but was summoned to various other locations when required. His identity is never disclosed, neither within the pages nor in the surrounding files. Some believe this was intentional. Inside the diary are brief entries. Each one documents an episode from a case he managed. Some are only a few sentences long. Others occupy entire pages. The handwriting is uneven, hurried, but consistently clear. There is no sense of hysteria, only profound professional concern. One entry recounts a young woman who spoke Latin fluently, despite never having studied the language. Another describes a boy whose voice would suddenly change, sounding like a much older person. A different case mentions violent reactions to prayer, shrieking at the sight of a crucifix, and objects moving in the room without physical contact. There are no claims of levitation or head spinning, none of the sensational elements seen in movies. But what makes these entries unnerving is their simplicity. They are straightforward records, quiet notes, devoid of theatricality. Just the perspective of a person who witnessed phenomena he could not rationally explain. Near the end of the journal, the priest records a curious thought. He writes, "The most dangerous ones are not the ones who scream. The most dangerous ones are the ones who smile." That line is doubly underlined. No further explanation is provided. Another entry simply reads, "It followed me back. I did not let it enter." These pages were never intended for public consumption. They were written as a record, perhaps even as a caution for the next man who would assume the same responsibility. They were stored in the restricted area of the archive, not because they posed a reading hazard, but because their contents were too difficult to forget. The Vatican has never officially acknowledged the diary's existence, but it is there, placed among official reports and ancient prayers. The quiet account of a man who ventured into darkness with only his faith as protection. His words were never spoken aloud in a church, never quoted in sermons. But for those who discover the journal, his narrative speaks just the same. Not loudly, but clearly. Not with panic, but with honesty. And sometimes the quietest words are the most unforgettable. Beneath the elaborate rooms of the Apostolic Palace, below the smooth marble floors, where popes have walked for centuries, there is a small chamber not indicated on any tourist map. Few people know it is there, even fewer are aware of what is kept inside. This location, silent and darkened, is rumoured to hold an item the Church has never publicly mentioned. A single book, known only by its legendary title, The Manuscript of Tears. The story begins with a construction crew. In the year 1970, repairs were needed beneath the papal apartments after a minor water leak damaged a wall section. While cleaning part of the basement, a worker found an iron door sealed behind solid stone. The door had no handle, only a small cross engraved at eye level. It took several days before the door could be successfully opened. Behind it was a narrow stairway leading down to a room no larger than a tiny cell. The air inside was completely still and cold. In the centre of the room sat a plain wooden table, and on that table, wrapped in cloth and tied with a red ribbon, was a manuscript. No markings, no title, no known author. It was immediately delivered to a cardinal that evening, and following that the room was sealed shut again. Only a select few were permitted to read what the pages contained. Those who did never provided complete reports. But from private notes left in later years, a strange pattern began to emerge. The manuscript was written in Latin, with some parts in Greek and Aramaic. The handwriting was fluid, but the ink had faded substantially in many areas. What made the text unique was not just the various languages, it was the subject matter. Every chapter seemed to begin with a short devotional, followed by what appeared to be personal admissions, not from one person, but from many different individuals. The handwriting varied as if multiple people had contributed. The voices within the manuscript spoke of supernatural sightings, of statues observed weeping, of voices heard in empty spaces, of disturbing dreams that occurred night after night, and always concluded the same way, in silence and with tears. One section described a pope waking every night at the same exact time, weeping without understanding the reason. Another passage referred to a secret that could never be spoken out loud, one that harms the soul when it is brought into the open. Yet the words never explicitly state what the secret is. Only fragmented sentences, cautions, and echoes of sadness. A few people believe the manuscript was left as a sort of reflective surface, not to show the reader their future, but to expose their personal failings. It did not curse anyone. It did not issue commands. It simply presented the truth, truths too burdensome to carry for long. Today the book remains locked away somewhere beneath the Vatican, not because it is considered evil, but because those who read it wept uncontrollably, again and again. And so they named it the Manuscript of Tears, not based on its subject matter, but because of the powerful emotional reaction it provoked. In a discreet drawer within the Vatican archives, behind rows of long-standing documents, there is a letter with no exterior envelope and no official seal. It is written in Italian, in a careful but rushed script. The paper has slight burn marks along the edges. In the corner, in light ink, is a name that continues to cause disagreement and silence in certain church circles: Giordano Bruno. Bruno was a philosopher, a deep thinker, and a man who conceptualized the universe as something far vaster than anyone had previously dared to imagine. In his era, the late 1500s, a time when scientific discovery and religious belief frequently clashed, he proposed that stars were not merely bright spots in the night sky, but suns like our own, each potentially orbited by other worlds. He spoke of limitless space, of intellectual freedom, and of a God who could not be restricted by a single viewpoint of the world. The Church perceived his words as dangerous. Bruno was put on trial for heresy in the year 1593. His ideas were considered too radical, too non-traditional. He refused to retract his convictions. For 7 years he was detained and questioned. Ultimately, he was executed by burning at the stake. In the year 1600, his mouth was sealed shut with a piece of iron to prevent him from speaking a final word to the onlookers. As for the letter in the drawer, no one can confirm when it was written. Some speculate it is a copy of a last message he sent from his cell. Others say it was written years earlier, secretly kept by someone who felt his voice should not be permanently silenced. The letter makes no argument, it assigns no blame, it simply poses a question. If thought is a divine endowment, why is it treated with such fear? That sentence is isolated in the centre of the page, written twice, once in ink, and once in what appears to be charcoal. Some believe the charcoal was added by a Vatican scribe years later. Others believe Bruno wrote both versions himself. The remainder of the letter speaks gently of truth, not truth proclaimed loudly from the rooftops, but the kind of truth whispered in solitude, the truth that blossoms when one dares to look beyond conventional teachings. He writes of light not as fire, but as understanding, and of darkness not as evil, but as the quiet space where new ideas are born. The Church has never publicly confirmed possession of this letter, but a few scholars have viewed it. One described it as a candle flickering in a room no one wants to enter. Bruno paid the ultimate price for his thinking, but even in death, his words were not forgotten. They were kept hidden in a location where silence holds more power than stone. And even now, his question, if thought is a gift, why is it feared? The Vatican may never respond, but the letter remains, waiting silently in the dark, like a voice still communicating across the centuries. In the quiet corridors of the Vatican archives, surrounded by volumes kept in silence, one question rises above all others. What truly makes a text hazardous? It is not always the falsehoods, it is the truths. Lies can be easily dismissed, they can be corrected, ignored, or simply forgotten. But a truth that challenges everything, a truth that unveils reality even slightly, can destabilize the foundation of our world, and those are the types of documents the Church has kept shrouded in mystery. Some of these books speak of concepts older than Christianity itself. Others present alternative versions of stories long accepted as definitive. They do not shout, but subtly suggest. They do not destroy belief, but they expand its limits. They open the mind to questions, and sometimes it is the question, more so than the ultimate answer, that breeds anxiety. One forgotten scroll tucked in a deep corner of the archive describes the early years of the Church in ways that conflict with contemporary teachings. It names holy figures who were never officially recognized. It recounts teachings omitted from the Bible, not because they were false, but because they represented a divergence. Another volume lists the actual names of early martyrs, but some of those names are absent from the Church's official historical record. The reasons for this are unclear. Perhaps their stories were too complex. Perhaps their martyrdom raised difficult questions no one wished to address. There is a consistent element among all these texts. They reveal realities that were once widely known, but are no longer publicly acknowledged. One priest, writing in the year 1942, noted in his diary that the Church does not fear the darkness of ignorance, but the blinding light of too rapid understanding. He wrote, "We conceal not what is untrue, but what the world is not yet prepared for." This notion that truth must be rationed has guided the Church's handling of certain writings for hundreds of years. The issue is sometimes less about direct control and more about timing. What happens if a certain revelation reopens a wound that is not fully closed? What if sharing a specific piece of information causes deeper harm than it does good? Yet there is a counter-argument to consider. What if the reason a truth is kept hidden is not because it is dangerous at all, but because of power dynamics, uncertainty, or the deep complexities of the human spirit? Tucked away somewhere in the archives is a volume that lacks a title. It gathers accounts of early spiritual visions, communications supposedly originating from angels, saints, or even forces more enigmatic. These visions describe a sense of peace. The messages are rich with expectation. However, the individuals associated with these accounts were later charged with heresy. The book was secured, not due to malice, but because its contents did not align with accepted doctrine. Therefore, when we attempt to define what makes a document a threat, we need to look past the literal words. A dangerous book is not necessarily one that utters curses or pronouncements of doom. Sometimes its danger lies in simply stating the truth a little too plainly. Deep in the Vatican archives, beyond stacks of crumbling documents and misplaced charts, is a weighty volume bound in black leather. It is unremarkable. It makes no attempt to draw attention to itself, but its pages are filled with names the Church once tried to wipe from history. This is the Inquisition's Black Ledger. The Inquisition was established during the Middle Ages. Its purpose was to defend the faith, to find and pass judgment on those accused of straying from the official path. Initially, the process seemed straightforward. Individuals who challenged church dogma were summoned, prompted to confess, and offered a route back to belief. But as time went on, fear grew rampant. Doubt quickly became a hazard, and silence became the only reliable protection. The Black Ledger was never meant for public view. It served as a private accounting maintained by those who directed the Inquisition. It listed the names of the accused, the charges levelled against them, and the ultimate decisions of their trials. Some entries include short remarks beside them. Repented, exiled, executed. Others bear only dates. Many show absolutely nothing. There is no artistry in this volume. No fancy lettering, no delicate illustrations, just simple ink, line after line. But the ledger's true influence rests not in its stated contents, but in what it perpetually recalls. These were individuals who spoke too quickly, who formed their own beliefs, or who simply held a different understanding of faith, and for that they were condemned. One name is more distinct than the others. A woman from Spain brought to trial in the year 1547 was charged with receiving angelic messages without official church approval. She recorded her spiritual experiences and shared them within her community. The church deemed this a serious threat. Her hearing lasted for 3 days. The ledger notes she was burned, but no documentation of her writings has survived. Only her name remains, silently preserved within this historical record. Another name belongs to a monk who questioned the proper handling of confessions. He believed that divine forgiveness could be granted directly, without requiring the intercession of a priest. His ideas circulated rapidly, and the church responded just as fast. He was silenced. His works were obliterated. His trial has no specified outcome, just a single entry, absorbed into silence. The ledger is not accessible to the general public. Most people will never see it. However, a select group of researchers have examined portions of it. One of them referred to it as a memorial site without monuments. Another observed that this book does not accuse. It holds memory. That might be the most potent aspect of all. The Black Ledger does not make a scene. It does not recount its stories with outrage or grief. It simply itemizes them, life after life, line by line. Proof that even in a place where quiet obedience dominates, memory always finds a way to speak. And perhaps that is the true role of this ledger. Not to create shame or dread, but to remind us that truth is not easily eradicated. Sometimes it waits patiently in ink, in obscurity, in the names of those who once dared to believe differently. There is a tale quietly shared among scholars and historians concerning a registry that is never openly recorded, a list maintained not by the Vatican proper, but by a certain internal group. The Jesuits, recognized for their intellectual rigor and thorough education, The Jesuits function as the Church's philosophers, instructors, and, at times, its hidden custodians. Among their unspoken duties is the preservation of what some term the Silent Index. This index is unlike the notorious Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the official public catalogue of forbidden books that was known globally, circulated and distributed until its discontinuation in the year 1966. The Jesuit registry, however, has never been released publicly. It exists in deep secrecy, and some speculate it contains books so dangerous that even high-ranking clergy are forbidden from reading them. No one knows exactly how many titles are included in this list. Some suggest only a few dozen, others estimate hundreds. What is established is that the books are not all ancient. Some are very old documents, full of odd figures and languages no longer used. Others are more recent, written in contemporary style, but filled with ideas that the Church quietly worries about. Most of these texts do not deny spiritual faith. Instead, they challenge its boundaries. They question narratives that have been accepted for many hundreds of years. They propose views of the afterlife that do not conform to traditional teachings. They discuss celestial beings in unexpected ways and explore truths that blur the line between science and the spiritual realm. One volume, composed in the late 1800s, depicts the human soul as something that constantly transitions between dimensions. Not just one existence, but many. Another claims that specific prayers, if recited in the opposite direction, do not provide protection but instead create an opening. These are not books that confront loudly. They speak softly, and that is precisely what makes them so threatening. The Jesuits do not protect the index with strong doors and keys. They protect it with absolute silence. Only a select few within the order are permitted to know the titles. Even fewer are trusted to examine them. Before doing so, they swear a solemn pledge, which is not merely about confidentiality, but about internal readiness. They must commit not to lose their faith, not to reveal what has not been asked, and most importantly, not to record anything in writing. One former Jesuit, before his death in the year 1983, offered a single sentence to a confidant. He stated, "Some books do not scream their evil. They simply ask questions too perfectly. The Silent Index, assuming its reality, is not a mechanism for control. It is an act of safeguarding minds, convictions, and something far more fundamental. Not to permanently withhold information, but to reserve it until the proper moment. And perhaps that moment will never arrive. So the books remain unopened, their names unmentioned, their pages undisturbed, because sometimes the most dangerous book is not the one that spreads falsehoods. It is the one that communicates the truth in a manner we are not yet prepared to receive." In a small secured storage area within the Vatican archives, there is a book wrapped in material that is old and faded. It has no markings, there is no designation on its cover, no hint to what it contains. But inside are pages filled with precise instructions, cautions, and rituals known only to a few. This is the Exorcist Training Manual, a book never mentioned in public addresses and rarely named out loud. The Church does not make this manual available to just anyone. Only priests chosen for the role of exorcist are authorized to review it, and even then, only after extensive preparation. The book is not intended to promote fear, but to offer readiness. It instructs on how to identify spiritual distress, how to speak prayers that have been used for generations, and how to maintain composure when the environment around you begins to shift. It is enclosed in a mantle of silence, not only because it is seldom accessed, but because it demands silence from those who study it. The words within are intended to be vocalized only during the official rite of exorcism. Reading them aloud for any other reason is strongly discouraged. Some believe that doing so can invite forces that are difficult to dismiss. The text opens with a simple statement. This manual is not for speculation, but for active use. It does not attempt to prove the existence of negative forces. It presumes the reader is already certain. From this starting point, it provides step by step the process for the ancient rite. How to set up the space, what items to bring, which prayers to use, and what signs to watch for if the spirit is resisting. There are also personal observations in the margins, thought to be written by practicing exorcists throughout history. One comment reads, "Do not engage too early. Allow the stillness to respond first. The louder the reaction, the deeper the problem." These minor annotations are not part of the established ceremony, but they represent accumulated wisdom. They serve as a reminder to the reader that this labour is not just physical, but profoundly spiritual. Some accounts speak of a chapter in the rear of the book that is rarely read, a sequence of prayers reserved for only the most severe situations, language once shared among isolated monks long before the modern church took form. These prayers are reputed to be older than the Latin language itself. Few have ever employed them, even fewer have described what followed. The Vatican has never officially confirmed the manual's existence, but among those trained for this work, it is simply referred to as the book. Nothing more, nothing less. It is not something to be feared, it is something to be respected, not because of the control it contains, but because of the power it confronts. The Exorcist Training Manual is not an offensive tool. It is a source of guidance, a protective barrier, and a lesson that some aspects of the Church's work occur far from public scrutiny, where language must be selected with precision and quiet often carries the most weight. It remains hidden in the dark, not for casual study, but to be utilised only when genuinely required. In the secret sections of the Vatican, there is a small team of clergy whose responsibilities are never mentioned during Sunday services. They are neither instructors nor writers. They do not address large assemblies or occupy ceremonial seating. These individuals are part of the Vatican's exorcism department, and their mandate is straightforward in concept, but incredibly difficult in practice, to face what others choose to ignore. Their operations are conducted away from public view, frequently in secluded chambers with thick walls and no openings. The prayers they recite are drawn from texts not shared with the outside world. They are cautious, highly trained, and deeply devout. But even they are not always ready for what ultimately happens. One priest who served from the year 1974 to 1981 left behind a collection of private records now filed away in the Vatican archive. His handwriting is neat, steady, but the events he documents are not. In one entry, he chronicled an instant during an exorcism where, as he prayed, the individual before him suddenly ceased convulsing. For a few brief seconds, the room became silent. Then, from the absolute stillness, emerged a voice that was clearly not the person's own, calm, slow, and certain. "You speak the words," it stated, "but do you truly believe them?" The priest did not reply. He simply resumed the prayer. But he never forgot that question. He felt it was less of a provocation and more of a serious warning. In a different document, another priest from the year 1968 wrote about a young boy who had no formal education in Latin, yet during the ceremony the boy began to speak the ancient language, replying coherently to the prayers with words no child should possess. But it was not only the language that brought a chill to the room. It was the quality of the voice itself, deep, echoing, and strangely composed. It spoke with knowledge, with history, and at times it posed difficult questions. One time it asked, "Why do you stand in fear of what you are meant to serve?" These occurrences are unusual, but they are not unheard of. Some within the department suggest the voice does not always scream. It sometimes whispers. And when it does, it attempts to intimidate not with hostility, but with truth or a plausible imitation of it. The specific phrase the voice uses in reply is not found in any standard church teaching. It is discreetly shared among exorcists, almost like a code, a reminder that occasionally during the rite, the quiet is shattered in a way that resists simple explanation. These accounts are not reproduced in books, they are not verified in official press releases, but they survive in the memoranda, the personal diaries, and the recollections of those who have performed the duty. And they are preserved not to create terror, but to ensure remembrance, because the work of these men is not fundamentally about dominance or fear. It is about taking a stand in the darkness with faith as their guidance, and accepting that sometimes when they speak to the void, something answers back. Not loudly, not always maliciously, but always present and listening. In a small, inconspicuous side chapel of the Vatican, there is a display case made of glass and fine metal. Most visitors walk right past it without a second glance. Inside, they observe the customary items: a pair of worn slippers once belonging to a pope, a silver rosary, and a cup used during a holy service. But behind the ornate presentation, concealed in a section that is never visible to the public, lies something few people even realise exists: a book, old, slim, and encased in dark leather. It is known as the Ritual Book of Leo XIII. Pope Leo XIII served from the year 1878 to 1903. He is remembered for numerous accomplishments: his theological writings on belief and reason, his advocacy for the working class, and his efforts to guide the Church into the modern era. But what many overlook, or perhaps never knew, is that Leo also had a profound focus on spiritual conflict. He maintained that evil was not simply an abstract concept, that it had concrete form, a means of expression, and sometimes a physical presence. One famous anecdote tells of a day when Leo suddenly collapsed during Mass, only to awaken a few moments later, visibly shaken and pale. He is said to have gone directly to his writing table and composed a prayer, one so potent that it was later mandated to be said at the close of every Mass for many decades. The prayer, known as the Prayer to Saint Michael, speaks directly of conflict, protection, and forcing evil spirits back into the darkness. It was forceful, direct, and distinct from anything the Church had publicly endorsed in centuries. But that was only the portion the public was permitted to know. The remainder was safeguarded in his private ritual book. This volume, secured behind the display case, contains prayers and ceremonies that were never authorized for public use. Some were penned by Leo himself, others were transcribed from much older sources. One section is reportedly written in a version of Latin no longer utilized in standard church liturgy. Another page features a collection of symbols next to the words, as if denoting something only a highly trained priest would comprehend. The book does not just offer directions, it includes warnings, notes inscribed in the margins, possibly by Leo or by the exorcists who succeeded him. One line states, "Only recite this if the shadow refuses to depart." Another advises, "To open this book without sincere devotion is to welcome a great silence." It is not clear why the book was ultimately hidden. Perhaps it was never intended for widespread viewing. Perhaps later popes were cautious about its application, but the central fact remains: it is authentic, it is sealed, and it is guarded behind the artifacts of a holy figure who once witnessed something during Mass that changed his perspective permanently. Now it rests in the quiet, a manual of ritual, of spiritual strength and of enforced silence. Not forgotten, only kept secret, just beneath the surface, like countless truths concealed within the very structure of the Vatican. The story starts not in the centre of Rome, but in the dry, blowing air of the desert. In the year 1947, near the rugged hills of Qumran, close to the Dead Sea, a young shepherd tossed a rock into a cave. Instead of a solid thud, he heard the soft sound of clay breaking. Inside that cave, preserved for nearly 2,000 years, were ceramic vessels containing scrolls, ancient written materials that would soon send shockwaves through the world of religious belief and historical study. These documents would eventually be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of the scrolls held parts of religious scripture, devotionals, and rules of conduct from a community of Jewish individuals who lived a secluded life in the desert. But some of the writings were unlike anything contained in the Christian Bible. They narrated events that had never been documented before, accounts of angels and peculiar entities, predictions of a great final war between the forces of good and evil, and utterances from religious prophets who were not named in the Church's accepted texts. As copies began to reach scholars around the world, the Vatican requested access. A few of the scrolls were sent to Rome, and there, in the quiet corridors of the Vatican archives, a dedicated team of language experts was assigned the task of translation. What they uncovered was not simple to process. Among the scrolls were documents that spoke of not one Messiah, but two. One was designated as a king, the other as a priest. Together they were intended to usher in justice and healing. This concept did not align with the singular figure of Christ as the Church had defined him. And although the scrolls predated the New Testament, they raised a subtle, difficult question. Had the foundational narrative evolved over the centuries? One scroll detailed a teacher of righteousness, a man who endured betrayal and a fatal end only to be revived in memory, not in bodily form. Another mentioned a concealed book said to contain the names of those destined to understand the truth before the ultimate conclusion. But no such volume has ever been located. A number of these ancient scrolls were analysed. Others were simply put aside. A few completely vanished, sealed away in cabinets that only a select few had authorization to access. The Vatican never denied the significance of the documents. However, they also never clearly discussed the ones that seemed to contradict their doctrine. A silent boundary was established between spiritual belief and historical fact, between what could be accepted and what was best left unread. Despite this, duplicates were made and translations were preserved. Deep in the dusty archives rests a file binder labelled simply Qumran. Inside it are translator's notes, ancient prayers and perplexed commentary, written by those who struggled to reconcile their belief with the new facts. The scrolls did not confirm or refute any claims, yet they served as a reminder to the Church and to the world that ultimate truth is not spoken with a single voice. It arrives in echoes, in questions, in pages hidden in ceramic jars beneath the dry desert ground. And sometimes, the narratives we think we fully grasp are merely the introduction. The remainder of the story waits silently in aged parchment and sand. For almost 2,000 years, Judas Iscariot has been remembered as the ultimate betrayer, the man who handed Jesus over for 30 silver coins. His name became a synonym for treason, and his story was recounted with deep sorrow and anger. But in 1978, a mysterious manuscript appeared in the Egyptian desert. It would require years of research, but once the interpretation was finished, it presented a portrayal of Judas that was completely unforeseen. This was neither a historical account nor a mythological tale. It was a gospel, the Gospel of Judas. Penned in the ancient Coptic language, the Gospel recounts the relationship between Jesus and Judas, but they are not presented as adversaries. In this document, Judas is not depicted as the villain. He is the one disciple who truly grasps Jesus' nature. He is the chosen one, not the condemned. Jesus speaks to him privately, sharing deep secrets, and instructs him that by giving him up, Judas is actually fulfilling the divine plan. The Gospel concludes not with fury, but with something that feels like mutual trust. If this account is genuine, it fundamentally alters everything. But that remains the key question. Is it genuine? Biblical experts estimate the Gospel of Judas was composed in the 2nd century, long after Judas's death. It is not one of the 4 Gospels included in the canonical Bible. It was not written by anyone who personally knew Jesus or the original disciples. Yet the message carries influence. The words demonstrate how early Christian communities, notably a sect known as the Gnostics, had entirely different interpretations of faith. The Gnostics were believers in secret spiritual insight. They held that the spirit was pure and the physical world was a lower realm to be escaped. To them, Judas was not wicked. He was essential, a guardian of profound truth, and his action was not a betrayal but a necessary release. The Vatican has never formally accepted the Gospel of Judas as part of its official teaching. It is not utilized in worship. It is not read during the Mass. However, when the manuscript was examined in the early 2000s, the Church did not deny its existence. A spokesperson merely stated that it changes nothing regarding the core of their faith. Still, it raised important questions. What if Judas was not the traitor? What if the narrative passed down through centuries represented only one viewpoint? And what happens to a deeply held belief when the alleged villain is revealed to be a chosen intimate? The Gospel of Judas is now kept in a museum, but a copy is rumoured to exist within the Vatican archives. Some suggest the initial translation was done in Rome before the public was ever aware of it. Others believe notes were added to the margins by senior church figures who worried its contents might confuse ordinary believers. Whether true or not, the Gospel reminds us of a deeper concept, that even the most familiar sacred story can have an alternate telling, and sometimes the real danger is not a falsehood, but a truth that compels us to look again, to listen closely, and to question what we were perhaps never meant to fully understand. Long before the first books of the Bible were collected and bound, there existed another volume, far older than commonly realized and filled with visions that remain difficult to interpret. This book is referred to as the Codex of Enoch. It tells the life of a man who walked closely with God, who witnessed the heavens open up and returned with messages that were simply too strange for his era. Enoch appears only briefly in the canonical Bible, mentioned as a person who lived a righteous life and was taken directly by God without dying, but the complete story of Enoch, including his dreams and prophetic visions, was once fully recorded. His book was read and respected in the early years of the Church. Even some of the earliest Christians, including St. Jude, quoted passages from it. So why is the Codex of Enoch no longer included in the Bible today? That query has no straightforward answer. The Codex of Enoch describes a world populated by angels, watchers, and powerful beings who crossed the boundary between the celestial and the earthly. It speaks of a period when certain angels became romantically involved with human women and imparted forbidden knowledge to mankind. Enoch writes of stars that speak, of portals in the sky, and of a final judgment so immense that even the sun and moon stand still out of fear. The imagery is bizarre, the language both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Some of the visions describe events that are still yet to come. Others appear to fundamentally revise what we thought we knew. As the Church began the process of establishing its canon, which is the final authorized collection of books to be included in the Bible, the Codex of Enoch was deliberately excluded. Some argued it was too deeply steeped in mysticism. Others feared it would create confusion for the common believer, and so, gradually, the book disappeared from common awareness. It was not officially banned, but quietly allowed to be forgotten. But the Vatican did not entirely forget it. Concealed within the archives is a complete copy of the Codex, translated into Latin centuries ago. It is kept in a designated drawer, far away from public scrutiny. A few specialized scholars have been permitted to read it. One of them wrote that this is a book that makes you feel impossibly small beneath the stars. Another commented that it reads like a vivid dream you recall long after waking up, even if you can't quite grasp its meaning. The Codex of Enoch is not dangerous because it contains lies. It is dangerous because it stretches so far beyond the limits of what most people are prepared to believe. It communicates through symbols, through complex riddles, through descriptions of heaven that do not match familiar stained glass or paintings, but feel far more ancient, like they originated from the very first spoken word. The Church may never incorporate it into the Bible, but the book remains, waiting, not in flames or darkness, but in quiet ink on fragile antique pages. And sometimes it is not what we clearly see that terrifies us the most. It is what we almost understand. In the deepest, most restricted section of the Vatican archives, where the air is heavy with dust and the weight of history, there is a Bible unlike any other in existence. At first glance, it appears to be a typical manuscript. Handwritten leaves, supple parchment, and polished Latin script. But it is not the printed sacred words that make this Bible so enigmatic. It is what was later added in the margins. Someone long ago inscribed notes next to the holy text. Notes that question, notes that express doubt, notes that challenge fundamental agreement. It has come to be known subtly as the Heretic's Bible. No one is certain who the author was. The Bible itself is believed to have been copied by hand in the late 1300s, but the handwriting in the margins is clearly from a different person, possibly added 100 years later. The ink is darker, the letters are more pointed, and the mind behind the commentary is clear, searching, brave, and utterly without fear. In one margin, next to a verse describing heaven, the writer asks, "What if paradise is not a specific place, but merely a state of awareness?" Near the story of creation, a single line is scribbled. Was this passage written to offer comfort, or to state a genuine truth? These are not angry words or insults. They are deeply contemplative. Still, they press hard against the established walls of doctrine. One of the most unforgettable comments sits next to a verse about final judgment. It simply says, "If God already knows everything, why must we be afraid of being seen?" Just 7 words, but potent enough to cause major controversy even today. For many centuries, this Bible was kept hidden, not because the main religious text was flawed, but because the accompanying notes might prompt readers to question the very foundation of their beliefs. Some ideas, once given voice, can never truly be unsaid. There is no name signed anywhere in the book, no clue to the identity of the person who committed these thoughts to paper. Some speculate it was a monk who grew weary of being told what he was not permitted to question. Others theorize it was a priest quietly battling the immense weight of his own profound faith. A few even believe it may have been a woman, a female scholar who secretly copied texts when that work was denied to her gender. Whatever the truth may be, the Church kept the Bible. It was not burned or intentionally destroyed. It was placed in storage, subjected to analysis, and then sealed away. In 1983, a Vatican historian discovered it while reviewing old catalogue records. He described the marginal notes as honest, profoundly brave, and intensely dangerous. He chose never to publish his findings. Today, the Heretic's Bible rests behind protective glass in a temperature-controlled vault. It has no public display label, but those who have been allowed to read it describe the experience as strangely comforting, like hearing a whisper of thoughts you yourself have never fully articulated but always somehow felt. The original text remains untouched, its sacred words firm on the page, and in the margins, the quiet, persistent questions still breathe. They exist not to undermine faith, but to remind us that even within the most sacred lines, honest doubt can gently write its name and never entirely fade away. His name is missing from all official records. No title, no formal ceremony, no published written work. He was simply a hired custodian employed in 1962 to clean the lower-level floors of the Vatican archive. Each morning he would arrive before anyone else, carrying a ring of keys, a simple cloth bag, and a reserved manner that made him practically unnoticeable. But this man, largely forgotten by staff, possessed a secret few could have guessed. He was fluent in Latin, not merely common prayers and simple phrases, but full literary fluency. He had learned the language as a young boy in a monastery before leaving the order for reasons no one ever bothered to ask. His hands were rough from work and his speech was slow and deliberate, but when his eyes scanned the ancient documents he comprehended things that the official scholars often missed. For years he quietly pushed his cleaning cart through the echoing stone hallways of the archive, wiping dust from shelves and sweeping the patterned floors in total silence. No one ever noticed when he would pause briefly near a certain cabinet, reading the titles on the spines of the antique books. No one ever questioned him when he lingered late, claiming he required additional time to scrub the stone staircases. But he was observing, absorbing, and committing things to memory. One cold winter morning, long after the rest of the staff had departed, he found a folder unintentionally left open on a desk. It contained a few loose pages written in Latin so archaic it almost sang to him. He briefly glanced at it, intending only to appreciate the elegant handwriting, but the words immediately captured his attention. They were fragments from a document labelled Manuscript 401b. The specific passage he read spoke of a distinct voice that emerges only from deep silence. It warned about a mirror that reflects not your physical face, but the image of your true soul. And it concluded with a difficult question. Would you seek a truth that makes you forget who you are once you finally grasp it? The janitor remained silent, even when the supervising priest returned. He simply nodded respectfully, folded his cleaning cloths, and departed. Years later, in 1983, a young seminarian performing research on forgotten staff records stumbled upon an old notebook. It had no name visible on the cover. Inside were detailed handwritten notes entirely in Latin, not from an academic scholar or a powerful priest, but written in the recognizable hand of the janitor. He had copied short passages purely from memory, small lines of text, odd prayers, comments scribbled in the margins that pose questions no one else had the courage to put down on paper. One entire page simply stated, "There are books locked away here for reasons that go far beyond mere fear. Some should definitely stay closed, but others might be capable of saving us if only we were truly prepared for them." The notebook was silently returned to its drawer. The young seminarian chose to say nothing, but the profound memory of that quiet, unassuming man who walked the marble floors unseen for over 20 years still lasts. Not because of the tasks he performed, but because of what he saw, what he understood, and what he never once chose to speak of again. In 1974, a scholar named Father Matteo Valli was granted rare special permission to study a collection of sealed documents deep within the Vatican archives. He was not a well-known figure in the church hierarchy. Quiet, profoundly thoughtful, and somewhat reserved, he spent the majority of his time teaching at a small university just outside the city of Rome. But he possessed one unique ability that few others had: the skill to read not just classical Latin, but several ancient languages, including Syriac and Old Greek. This made him an invaluable asset to the Church, particularly when they required assistance with extraordinarily difficult-to-read texts. The request to study arrived without any prior warning. A short, formal letter, a quiet signature, a room access key. When he arrived at the archive, he was escorted to a narrow private study room and handed a heavy box wrapped tightly in red fabric. The priest who delivered it to him offered very little explanation. He said only this: "Be careful what knowledge you retain." Inside the box were pages marked clearly with the number 401b. Some of the pages were badly torn, others were filled with handwriting so tightly packed it looked as if it had been written without the writer ever lifting the pen. But Matteo did not rush his work. He spent many weeks translating the pages, line by line, writing detailed notes only in his own private journal. He worked late into every night, always completely alone, and never once requested assistance. Then abruptly, he was gone. He did not return to the archive to finish his work. He did not go back to the university to teach his classes. A few weeks later, a vague letter arrived at his former academic office. It was very short and completely unsigned. It said simply, "He has returned to private prayer." Years passed by. Some speculated he had abandoned the priesthood entirely. Others whispered that he had chosen a life of silence, something understood among scholars as a form of self-imposed living exile, but no one ever truly knew the truth. Then, in 1990, a new librarian working at the Vatican found a box that had been improperly filed behind a row of old hymnals. Inside this box was a small leather-bound notebook. Its pages were filled with Matteo's distinct handwriting, not complete translations, but scattered deep thoughts like fragments of a fading dream. The text speaks of strange mirrors that reflect more than mere light, of names that absolutely refuse to be forgotten, of profound truths that violently strip away the comforting illusions of belief. Another page simply read, "Some knowledge is not truly lost forever. It is deliberately concealed by choice, not because it is false, but because it burns far too close to the fundamental core of everything." There was no anger in his final written words, no expression of fear, only a sense of profound stillness, as if Matteo had stepped too close to something that permanently changed him and chose not to rejoin the world he left behind. The notebook was never officially recorded in the library log. It was silently placed back into the drawer. And so the scholar who had once been trusted with such a dangerous secret vanished, leaving behind only his precise handwriting, a set of unanswerable questions, and the soft memory of a voice that had once requested to read and was never heard from in public again. In the winter of 1959, a simple priest named Father Angelo Moretti began keeping a private journal. He was not a widely known figure in the church. He served his parish in a small, quiet town north of Rome, gave his homilies in a voice that was slightly strained, and spent the majority of his days ministering to the sick and the elderly. Parishioners described him as gentle, consistently reliable, and exceptionally quiet. But something dramatic shifted that year, something he found himself unable to articulate or explain. It all began with a vivid dream. He wrote that it arrived just before the sun rose during a particularly heavy rainstorm. In the dream, he saw himself standing inside the Vatican archives, even though he had never once visited the physical location. The air was unnaturally cold, the floor slick with a substance that looked mysteriously like oil. Heavy books lined every wall, ancient, thick volumes, and each one of them was protected by a heavy lock. But one specific lock was visibly broken. He slowly walked toward it, and as he gently opened the book, flames silently rose up from the pages, not burning hot, but completely silent. They did not physically harm him, but they immediately filled the entire room with an otherworldly light that seemed to emanate from nowhere at all. He recorded that he heard no shouting or screams, no recognizable voices. Only the sound of a very deep, slow breath, like a tremendous force waking up from a long sleep. When he finally opened his eyes, he was back sitting in his own bed, his heart racing, his hands visibly shaking. The candle he had left burning on his bedside table had unexpectedly gone out. He desperately attempted to forget the strange dream, but it returned again the following night and the night after that. He eventually wrote a letter to a bishop in Rome, carefully explaining everything he had seen, hoping for some kind of guidance or spiritual counsel. Weeks passed without a reply. So he wrote again this time, including more precise details. He vividly described the book. Its cover was black and smooth, like polished stone. Its title was written in Latin, but the letters appeared to shift and move on the page, as if they were alive. He insisted the book did not speak in words, but somehow it possessed absolute knowledge. He finally received one single short letter in return. It simply advised him. Some dreams are not profound visions. Let them simply pass you by. But Father Angelo found that he could not let the dream pass. He continued to meticulously write in his journal, and over the following months the dreams began to transform. The fire no longer remained contained within the book. It began to climb the cold walls. It visibly melted the candles. It started to reach the furthest corners of the Vatican itself. he began to believe that the fire was not a force of destruction, but something else entirely, something that burned away only falsehoods. "What if this fire is not meant to punish, but only to expose?" he once wrote. In early 1961, he unexpectedly abandoned his parish duties without warning. He travelled immediately to Rome. No one has ever confirmed if he successfully gained entry to the Vatican. But months later, his personal journal was discovered beneath the altar pew of a quiet chapel, carefully wrapped in a cloth and deliberately left behind. The very final page read, "If the book genuinely exists, it is not an instrument of evil, it is a mirror. And the powerful fire it brings forth is merely the truth that we are most afraid to face." No one ever saw Father Angelo again. Some suggested he had completely lost his mind. Others strongly believed he had been officially silenced by the Church. But in his strange dreams he had seen something the Church was completely unprepared to confront, and perhaps even today still is not ready for. The Swiss guards of the Vatican are renowned for their absolute stillness and discipline. They stand like perfectly carved statues, dressed in their recognisable brightly coloured uniforms, rigorously trained to protect the Holy Father and the sacred gates of the city-state. They are famously loyal, completely silent, and physically strong. But one young guard, many years ago, shattered that required silence and subsequently vanished without a trace. His name was Lucas Erhardt. He was only 24 years old, powerfully built, but known for his gentle and quiet disposition. Fellow guards recalled that he read frequently during his rest periods and always carried a small, worn Bible in his coat pocket. In the summer of 1972, Lucas was assigned to overnight duty near the quiet entrance of the Archive Hall, a peaceful post where virtually nothing of note ever occurred. But on one particular night, something definitely did happen. That evening, shortly after midnight, Lucas was suddenly asked to escort a visiting senior cleric who had been granted extremely rare access to a highly private reading room. It was highly unusual for guards to enter the lower-level rooms, but the request had come directly from a very high-ranking official, and Lucas immediately obeyed without asking any questions. The long hallway was cold and quiet, the stone walls lined with securely locked cabinets and sealed document drawers. When they finally reached the designated room, the cleric offered his thanks and stepped inside. Lucas started to turn to leave, but just before the heavy door closed completely, he hesitated. What he witnessed inside has never been officially confirmed. Some accounts suggest a book had been placed on the table, a very old volume. Its cover was incredibly dark, its pages bound together in a manner that did not match the other archival materials. Lucas, prompted by curiosity, or perhaps given silent permission, stepped closer and looked down at the volume. One page. That was all he was able to read. One single page, written entirely in Latin with an unusual flowing script. Moments later, a different priest entered and discovered Lucas still frozen there, his eyes wide open, his face utterly pale. In his tightly clenched hands, the small Bible he always carried was grasped so firmly that the leather cover had been severely bent. Silent tears were streaming down his face. He said nothing at all. Not at that moment, and not later. By the following morning, Lucas had completely vanished. He had left no note, no message behind, not even his uniform or weapons. Only his personal Bible remained, lying on the small desk in the guardroom. A single line was heavily underlined inside it, and their eyes were opened, and they knew. The Vatican never publicly released any official report concerning his disappearance. His family was simply informed that he had voluntarily abandoned his post. Some people quietly rumoured he had run away. Others believed he had witnessed something so profound he could not possibly bear the weight of it. Years later, a different guard mentioned that Lucas had once asked him a strange question. Do you think a truth too overwhelming can actually break a person's spirit? At the time, it seemed like a passing philosophical thought. Now, it feels like something much more significant. No one knows for certain what was written on that single page. The mysterious book was immediately returned to its secure case. The cleric who was present never spoke of that strange night again, but the memory of Lucas endures, a young man professionally trained to guard the church who saw one page of text and broke down weeping in a small, locked room deep inside the Vatican. Deep within the inner workings of the Vatican there is rumoured to be a painting on canvas, one that only a select few have ever seen, and even fewer are ever permitted to discuss. It is not publicly listed in any of the official museum catalogues. No informational signs or placards point toward it, but whispers claim it was originally painted by Caravaggio, the famously troubled master artist of dramatic light and shadow. Caravaggio was renowned for his dedication to painting harsh, authentic reality. No matter how unsettling the subject, his works depicted real pain, sweat, genuine fear, and overwhelming beauty all simultaneously. He was not known for flattering the church. He portrayed it exactly as he saw it, full of human struggle, raw flesh, and enduring soul. But one particular painting, which was never made public, was considered too unsettling even for his most loyal patrons. The story suggests that around 1605 Caravaggio was invited to Rome for a very special private commission. A cardinal had specifically requested he paint a portrait, not of a pope or a recognised saint, but of something entirely different, something much older. No one knows the precise reason for the unusual request, but Caravaggio accepted it immediately. He was notoriously drawn to deep mystery and the unknown. The painting was completed in a relatively short time, but those who viewed it claimed it was fundamentally unlike anything else he had ever created. It was reportedly a depiction of a man seated calmly at a wooden table, his hands formally folded, wearing very simple, unadorned robes. But there was something unnerving in the man's eyes that deeply disturbed the viewers. They claimed the figure did not merely look painted. He seemed utterly present, observing them not with simple love, but with terrifying, profound knowledge. One priest who viewed it wrote in his journal, "I felt as though I was being seen for every single thing I had ever done and every single thing I had ever successfully hidden." Other people who saw it reported strange physical sensations. The room would grow unexpectedly cold. Candles flickered wildly without any breeze, and some even claimed the man's painted eyes seemed to move or change when no one was actively looking at him. Within a few short days, the painting was swiftly removed from public display. It was quietly placed inside a large wooden crate, secured under heavy lock and key in a section of the Vatican not intended for the public eye. No official title was ever formally assigned to it. No photographs were ever taken, but those few who worked in the archive came to refer to it only as the portrait that stared back. Years later, in the early 1900s, a young art student assisting with restoration work claimed to have accidentally caught a glimpse of the canvas. He described the same calm, quiet figure, but added one detail. In the dim background of the painting, almost completely hidden by shadow, was a small book, closed and placed on the table, right beside the man's hand. When asked what the man's overall expression was, the student responded, "He looked like someone who already knew the absolute ending of a story I hadn't even begun to hear yet." The student promptly left Rome soon after. He never painted again professionally. To this day, there is absolutely no record of such a painting existing in the official church archives, but those who firmly believe in its existence argue it was never intended to be publicly shown. Because sometimes art does not merely reflect what we choose to see. Sometimes it brutally exposes what we are actively trying to ignore. It was a bitterly cold evening in January 1968 when Bishop Antonio Ferraro received a summons to Rome for a highly private meeting. He was not informed of the purpose, only instructed to arrive before dusk and to bring no aids or assistance. A car met him at the city limits and swiftly carried him through the Vatican gates, past the courtyards, and into a quiet stone building illuminated solely by old lanterns. Inside, the air was heavy and still. A priest wearing simple black robes guided him down a narrow, dimly lit hallway. They walked without exchanging any words, the sound of their footsteps the only noise in the long corridor. Finally, the priest opened a specific door and gestured for Bishop Ferraro to quietly enter. The room was small, empty of furniture except for a plain table and a single candle burning brightly at its centre. On the table lay a packet wrapped in distinctive red cloth and sealed with wax. The priest handed the packet to the bishop and said only this: "You must read this alone. Then you must decide what to do." The priest departed, gently closing the door behind him. Bishop Ferraro sat down, broke the wax seal, and slowly unwrapped the cloth binding. Inside were several yellowed, ancient pages written entirely in Latin. Initially they appeared to be fragments of an old prayer, or perhaps a sermon, but as he continued to read, his hands visibly began to tremble. The words described a specific book, one that was not listed in any of the church's public records, a book rumoured to contain a truth so incredibly potent that simply reading it had caused uncontrollable illness, self-imposed silence, and mental collapse. The pages he now held were a partial translation of a section of that legendary book, a desperate warning written centuries ago, secretly passed down by the few individuals who had seen the full text and consciously chosen never to speak of it publicly. One specific passage read, "The light reveals what the soul desperately tries not to admit. It strips the mask away from the faithful person and leaves only the first breath taken and the last breath to come. There are names contained within this book that do not originate from this world, and yet they somehow know ours." As he continued to read, the lone candle on the table flickered wildly, even though no air movement stirred the room. Bishop Ferraro felt something deep inside his core begin to fundamentally shift. Not sheer terror exactly, but a cold, chilling sense of understanding, as if something beyond his conscious thoughts was actively observing him and patiently waiting. He meticulously placed the pages back into the red cloth and carefully folded them. When the priest finally returned, the bishop asked only one question: "Why was I chosen for this?" The priest offered no verbal answer. He simply took the sealed packet back and gave a small nod. Bishop Ferraro left the Vatican that night and immediately returned to his modest diocese. He did not deliver any sermons for several consecutive weeks. When asked, he simply stated that he was spending more time in prayer and deep reflection. He never once spoke about that night again. But his personal journals, which were discovered after his death in 1978, contained one final chilling entry. "They showed me the truth. Not so I would act on it, but so I would bear the weight of it. Not every terrible burden is intended to be shared with others. Some are meant only to burn very slowly in absolute silence." And so the story continues. The event was never meant to leave the confines of the Vatican walls. But among the dedicated archivists and serious scholars who serve quietly behind heavy locked doors, it still lives on, passed down in hushed tones, told only when the long halls are completely empty. It is the strange story of a specific pope who attempted to end something with the use of fire and the profound silence that resulted. In the spring of 1942, during the darkest days of World War II, Pope Pius X was presented with a document by one of his most trusted personal aides. The document was clearly very old, bound in rough, worn leather, its pages stiff and brittle with age. It had no formal title visible on the cover, no external markings to explain its purpose, but inside were words written in Latin, ancient Hebrew, and a unique script no one could even properly identify. It was, they say, a complete copy of manuscript 4 Fomfui 1b. The Pope read only a small portion before deliberately closing the book and sitting in total silence. No one dared to speak for a very long time. Then he gave a simple, clear order: burn it completely. His voice was steady and calm, his eyes clearly weary. He did not raise his voice or offer any explanation for his sudden decision. He simply stated, "The book must not be allowed to remain." The order was immediately passed down to the Archivum Secretum, where two senior clerics were selected to carry out the instruction. One of them, Father Silvano, would later write in his private notes, "I held this thing of paper in my own hands, and I felt it was incredibly cold, like something that had waited far too long to be found." But when they brought the dangerous book to the small stone furnace located deep beneath the archive, something entirely unexpected happened. The fire refused to consume it. The flame, which had been strong and steady moments earlier, flickered and died down. The pages would not ignite. The edges curled slightly, but they never once turned to ash. They attempted 3 times in total. 3 times they completely failed. Finally, one of the clerics quietly whispered, "Perhaps it simply does not belong to us to destroy it." The Pope was immediately informed of the failure. He listened silently, then made his final definitive decision. The book was to be formally sealed, wrapped tightly in lead, and securely locked inside a plain box with no label whatsoever. The key was to be buried somewhere unknown, and no official record of the burning order would ever be committed to writing. But word still managed to travel into the quiet corners of the Vatican. Some claimed the book had mysteriously protected itself. Others believed that by attempting to destroy it, the Church had only inadvertently granted it more spiritual power. What cannot be burned, after all, is not merely a book. It is a profound question. Why? Why would a pope feel such terror about a simple set of words? And why did the ordinary fire refuse to obey a papal command? The book still lies hidden somewhere far below the marble floors, inside a vault that few people will ever be permitted to see. It was not successfully destroyed. It was merely concealed. But simply hiding something does not make it disappear. It only delays the inevitable moment when it will finally be fully exposed. Again. Not all sources of power in the Vatican wear the Pope's white robes. Hidden behind the public scenes, another figure actively watches over the Church, not in the spotlight, but deep within the institutional shadows. His name is not carved in any stone monument. Most people know him only by a distinct title whispered with a strange kind of deference: the Black Pope. This title does not imply wickedness or evil. It refers directly to the superior general of the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. Dressed in the traditional black clerical attire, he holds one of the highest and most influential positions in the entire Catholic world. His voice is rarely heard in public statements, but inside the walls of the Vatican, his opinion carries immense weight. And when dealing with sensitive texts, especially the ones not intended for common reading, his personal approval is always a required step. For many centuries, the Jesuits have been widely recognized as the primary keepers of esoteric knowledge. They educate, they engage in scholarly debate, and they produce written works. But they also act as guardians, protecting not only the sacred faith, but also the dangerous books that could potentially undermine it. Within the ancient archives, it is believed that every single forbidden text has been thoroughly reviewed by at least one Jesuit priest. Some documents are officially condemned, others are merely hidden away, but none pass through the system without receiving some form of mark or assessment from the society. It was the Jesuits, according to quiet internal reports, who were the first to study manuscript 451b, long before it acquired its fearful, ominous reputation. A specialized team of 3 Jesuit scholars, all high-ranking members of the order, were assigned to read, translate, and provide counsel on the text. They worked in absolute secrecy for over a year, recording all of their thoughts in a private log known only as the Index Obscura. That log, which has never been publicly released, reportedly contains phrases such as dangerously beautiful and not factually false, but profoundly frightening. At the conclusion of their demanding work, the ultimate decision was made. The manuscript would not be officially banned outright, nor would it be completely destroyed. It would be quietly stored away without any mention made in any public catalogue list. Only those with the Black Pope's direct personal permission could formally request access, and even then only under extremely strict supervision. In 1971, a short letter was found inside an old drawer at the Jesuit Curia headquarters in Rome. It was unsigned but clearly marked with the seal of the Superior General. The letter read, "There are many books that purely serve the cause of truth, and there are many books that sternly test it. This particular book does both equally. We do not officially reject it, we actively watch it." To watch in this specific context means more than merely reading. It means actively guarding, closely listening, patiently waiting. The Black Pope does not participate in public papal ceremonies or speak from the public balconies, but his eyes, and the observant eyes of the Jesuit order, are perpetually focused on the specific texts that touch the fine line between faith and genuine fear. They completely understand that a single powerful sentence, if left unchecked, can move human hearts in ways no formal sermon ever could. And so they remain firmly in the background, carefully turning pages most people will never have the opportunity to see, not because they actively seek danger, but because they deeply understand that profound knowledge is not always a comforting light. Sometimes it is a raging fire that requires extremely careful, skilled hands. And in the oppressive silence of the secret archive, the Black Pope's silent shadow still lingers, watching patiently as the unsettling words wait for the future. Within the Vatican, there are certain hidden spots where communication relies on silence, not on written words, and promises are sealed without ink. In these chambers, located beneath the main city, only a select number of individuals have sworn commitments that are never shared in public. These men were chosen not to disseminate information, but to safeguard it, especially when the information itself is too volatile to manage. It begins with a quiet rap upon a wooden entry. The chosen man has no idea what awaits him. He is led through dimly lit, silent passages, far removed from the sounds of people or liturgy. At the passage's end, a small room is waiting. Inside, there are only three elements: a lamp, a book with no identity, and a voice that never calls him by name. The voice reveals his duty. He is to be a custodian, not for wealth or relics, but for something significantly older. He will protect a document that no ordinary person should ever review, not because it is fraudulent, but because it contains ideas too close to truths the world is unprepared to encounter. The oath then follows. He places one hand on the volume. His other hand remains open, a gesture of trust. The words he utters are plain, yet weighty. He pledges to guard what must remain unread. He promises never to reveal its location, its title, or even its presence. If questioned about the text, he is to remain mute. If someone happens to glimpse the text, he is expected to report it. If someone reads the text, he is to act swiftly and without hesitation. The commitment is taken seriously. Once sworn, it binds him for the remainder of his days. There is no discharge, no retirement. The Church calls it a sacred charge, but those who are aware of it use a different term: a heavy burden. For hundreds of years, dozens of men have undertaken this vow. Priests, academics, and even security personnel. Some served only a brief period before being transferred. Others stayed concealed in the lower levels for years, traversing the same route daily, checking the security, breathing quiet prayers into the perpetual stillness. One of these men, known only as Brother Domenico, once confided in a private note, "It is not the text that poses a threat, it is the silence surrounding it, because silence accumulates, and what it conceals becomes a weight upon the spirit." He never mentioned the oath again. but his correspondence was discovered tucked inside a cabinet in the year 1983, abandoned like a pressed flower between the pages of a volume. Even today, the Church does not admit the vow's existence. There is no rite, no formal record, but the protectors endure. They operate in the dark, not as wardens of truth, but as guardians of time itself, overseeing words that must not be spoken, because some pages, once absorbed, never depart the consciousness. And some truths, once understood, are too much to bear alone. There is a specific room beneath the Vatican that few have entered and fewer still recall. It lacks an official title or any coordinates on a map. But among the staff, working deep within the records, it is known as the Mirror Chamber, not because it holds reflective glass in the conventional sense, but because of an event that once occurred there. A single moment that has never been duplicated. The account originates from the year 1938 during a period of escalating anxiety across Europe. Global conflict had not yet begun, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. Inside the Vatican, a subtle controversy had been developing. Behind closed doors, a manuscript which had been securely bound and hidden for a long time was once again being scrutinized. Some argued for its total destruction. Others maintained that only by reading it could its true significance be grasped. Following numerous discussions and unspoken ballots, a final choice was made. The volume, believed to be manuscript 451b, would be read aloud, but only on a single occasion, and only within a sealed, windowless compartment. The chosen room had walls of dark stone, finished to a surface as smooth as water. In the faint light of a lamp, the walls reflected indistinct, blurry forms, like mirrors submerged in liquid. This is why the clerics who prepared the area gave it the designation Mirror Chamber. 4 individuals were granted entry: a speaker, a transcriber, a witness, and a keeper. Each had sworn promises of total discretion. Each was entrusted with the deepest secrets of the Church. They entered the space at midnight. The text was placed upon a carved stone base. Then, as the light dimmed, the recital began. No one knows how many sheets were voiced aloud. The transcriber managed to write down only a few phrases. The witness remained silent for 3 full days afterward, and the keeper, an aged Jesuit renowned for his composure, left the Vatican shortly after, requesting assignment in a quiet settlement far from the capital. But one note survived. It was penned by the speaker himself, a man identified as Father Leon. Before securing the volume once more, he wrote one phrase on the rear cover of his notepad. The chamber did not resonate. The surfaces offered no reflection of us. Only the text was audible, and it was not my own voice that spoke. No subsequent public reading was ever attempted. The mirror chamber was sealed and forgotten. Some claim it was closed with wax and blessed in private. Others believe it was never used again for any purpose. But those who walk near its corridor occasionally report strange sensations. A sudden chill without cause, a quiet even when alone, a feeling that another person is standing close by. The volume is secured once more behind 3 protective locks, yet in that space, for a brief instant, its content was verbalized, and whatever was spoken there still clings to the stone. Inside the quiet passages of the Vatican, people often ask the same question in low tones. Not, is this document authentic? But a question far more disturbing. What if it is? What if the volume, concealed deep beneath marble and rock, is not a collection of falsehoods or forgotten narratives, but something else entirely? What if it is too accurate? This is the issue that has kept scholars awake, made priests pause during devotion, and caused more than one reader to step back from its pages. Because complete truth does not always offer comfort. Sometimes it shakes the foundation upon which we stand. The Church has always been a place of careful guidance. For centuries, it has determined what should be taught and what should be kept private. Not always to mislead, but to safeguard, to lead. Gently, rather than by shock. But even within these confines, there are realities that feel too much for the world to handle. The manuscript known as 451b Dodulz is one of those realities. Some believe it foretells events that are yet to come. Others state it reveals the true record of the Church's early days, not as myth or lesson, but exactly as it transpired. Unfiltered, clear, without the softening influence of time or interpretation. There are sheets, it is said, that name individuals who were omitted from the formal record, but who influenced events from the background. There are passages that suggest certain miracles were misunderstood, or that belief itself is more complex than simple devotion. But none of these are fabrications. That is what makes the volume a threat. If it were filled with imagination, it could be dismissed entirely. If it were crafted to mislead or confuse, it could be discarded. But the apprehension is not in what the volume gets incorrect. It is in what it might get absolutely right. A Vatican academic years ago summarized this well in a note later found in a locked drawer. The volume does not demolish belief. It expands it. It forces it open, like a seed breaking its shell in the sun. What emerges from it is not the faith we recognize, but something earlier, wilder, still genuine, but more difficult to maintain. That is why the volume remains unread, not because the Church fears the truth, but because it respects its influence. Truth, if spoken too loudly or too soon, can scatter what took centuries to establish. The world is not always prepared for every single truth. And so the volume waits, not for its validation, nor for its refutation, but for the moment when someone is brave enough to absorb the full weight of its content and still choose belief. Because sometimes the most hazardous thing is not a falsehood that deceives you. It is the truth that requires you to perceive reality differently. The Vatican has housed many peculiar texts over the years. Some are written in dead languages. Others are covered in symbols that no one can interpret. But there is one volume, stored in the lowest level of the archives, that has caused the most hushed concern. It is not only what the volume states that worries those who have seen it, it is how the volume was created, because no one can agree on who or what authored it. The script is unlike anything else. It does not match the styles of documented monks or scribes from the early church period. The characters are both sharp and flowing, as though written with both precision and speed. Some markings are so delicate they are only visible in lamplight. Others appear to change slightly when read aloud, as if responding to the speaker's voice. The pigment does not fade. Even after hundreds of years, the pages look as if time has not touched them. Analysis has shown that the ink is made from a substance no longer in use, dark like residue, but smooth like an unguent. And the writing surface, though pliable, is fireproof. A priest once attempted to tear a page and found that it flexed, but would not separate. Then there is the matter of the symbols. At the beginning of the volume there is a singular emblem. Not a phrase, not a cross. It is a shape with no known meaning, composed of lines that seem to shift, depending on the viewer's position. Some describe it as looking like an eye. Others say it resembles a gateway. One story recounts a Jesuit academic who stared at the opening page for several hours, then vacated the room and never spoke again. Another mentions an old copyist who stated, "This was not created by weary hands in the dark. It was created by something that does not require rest." Of course, no one in the church will confirm this. They state the volume is ancient, rare, and not intended for public examination. But behind closed doors, even the most trusted voices have posed the same question. Was it written by a human being, or was it received? Some suggest it came from a visionary, someone who experienced revelations too vast for their era. Others speculate if it was produced by a collective of early worshippers who wished to transmit a truth the world was not prepared to hear. But there are a few discreet and wary who suggest the volume may not have originated from human intellect at all. In the margin of one note discovered near the volume's vault, A single phrase was written in Latin, not fashioned by human hands, yet formed through them. The exact meaning is uncertain, but those entrusted with the volume's safety do not regard it with pride. They regard it with deep caution, because the content within may not be from this reality, and the source that created them, if ever identified, may not be one we can comprehend. The Vatican is an environment structured with careful thought. Every single stone, every passage, every piece of art holds significance. It is not merely a centre of faith, but a silent repository of emblems. Some of these emblems are readily deciphered: a simple cross, a bird, a ring of light. But others are less easy to interpret. These are the ones that recur in secluded spots, carved into hidden surfaces or concealed behind altars. Emblems such as mirrors, keys, and eyes. They are not present for ornamental purposes, they are communications, silent ones. The mirror is the first. It is not made of reflective glass. It often appears in paintings as still water or as a polished surface held by a figure who observes both the spectator and something unseen. In some sub-Vatican chambers, the stone walls reflect vague shapes, even when the room is empty. These mirrors do not simply show what is directly in front of them. They provoke a question: what is behind you, and what is residing within? The mirror calls for contemplation, but not just of one's appearance. It asks you to reflect on your spirit, your authenticity, and perhaps what you have actively chosen to ignore. Then there is the key, the mark of St. Peter. Keys are found throughout the Vatican, in art, on doorways, even etched into the floors. 2 keys crossed, one made of gold and one of silver. The gold is said to open the entrance to the spiritual realm. The silver opens concealed realities on this planet. But keys do more than unlock, they also seal. This is what makes the key a quiet caution. For every barrier you bypass, another may be closed behind you. Knowledge always comes with a price. And the Vatican, as the caretaker of many sealed items, understands this implicitly. The eye is the oldest of the 3. It observes from coloured glass windows. It gleams from ancient mosaics. Sometimes it is positioned at the centre of a triangle, sometimes alone, painted high on ceilings or tucked into forgotten corners. The eye represents surveillance, the state of being observed, even when you believe you are alone. But whose eye is it? Some say it is the eye of the divine, endlessly watching with love and fair judgment. Others say it is the Church's eye, perpetually safeguarding the believers. And then there are those who quietly suggest something else. A hidden force, neither benevolent nor malevolent, that simply sees all things and never forgets. When these symbols appear together, mirror, key, eye, they convey a message. Look inward. I will unlock what is hidden, but be aware that you are observed from within. The Vatican's emblems communicate when human voices cannot. They offer guidance, they issue warnings, and sometimes they ask questions we are not yet prepared to confront. Not every message is contained in volumes. Some are etched in solid stone, awaiting someone to notice and ponder their actual significance. Before the Vatican was built, before the large structure of St. Peter's stood against the sky, the land it occupies belonged to older deities. Long before the arrival of the Christian faith in Rome, people worshipped multiple gods: Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and others whose names now primarily exist in historical records. But their temples once dotted the urban landscape. Their carved figures stood in sacred spaces. Their devotions echoed through stone chambers now buried beneath the thoroughfares. And though centuries have passed, the fear of those deities has never fully subsided. When Christianity became the accepted religion of the Roman Empire, the Church faced a monumental task. It needed to establish not only faith, but also public confidence. This meant replacing the older practices without causing excessive upheaval. So in many instances, rather than destroying the non-Christian temples, the Church simply took possession of them. A holy site dedicated to Jupiter might be converted into a small place of Christian worship. A shrine for a goddess could be repurposed into a site honouring the Virgin Mary. Stone materials were reused. Architectural features were remodelled. Statues were removed, but sometimes only buried beneath the surface. Rome still retains this memory. There are locations within the Vatican where the rock is older than the church itself. There are designs in the floors and ceilings that incorporate symbols from the deep past. A sunburst here, a coiled snake there. Even the tall obelisk in St. Peter's courtyard was once part of a non-Christian monument. It originated in Egypt and stood in a place of devotion before ever being relocated to the spiritual heart of the Christian world. Some suggest these decisions were tactical, to demonstrate the Church's capacity to conquer older deities by establishing its own buildings atop their ruins. But others hold a different view. They believe the Church felt a certain dread toward what those older deities represented, not because they possessed reality in the same sense that saints do, but because belief leaves spiritual residue. Intense conviction, held by countless people over centuries, can influence the atmosphere of a location, and fear can remain in the very stone. Accounts from deep inside the Vatican mention peculiar chambers with strange energies, spaces where prayers resonate too intensely, where lights flicker without wind, where vivid dreams occur more frequently than true rest. These spaces often rest above ancient temples, long neglected but never fully erased. One priest wrote in the year 1973, "The surface we tread upon remembers. It suppresses its breath even as we construct new foundations. Perhaps that explains why some vaults remain sealed. Perhaps that explains why certain manuscripts that relate too closely to those older deities were never meant to be read. Because dread does not disappear when the names are changed. It waits beneath the stone, behind the altars, whispering in a sound that is not entirely gone. And occasionally, when the Vatican is still and the night is quiet, the old deities remind the world that they were once revered, feared, and never truly forgotten." There is a story murmured among Vatican scholars concerning a single written record secured in the absolute lowest part of the archives. It is brief, not aesthetically written, and has no identified author. Yet those who are aware of it say it may be the most alarming page the Church has ever kept private. It is called the chronometer. What makes this chronometer so unusual is not just its content, but its apparent function. It is said to be a simple piece of material, possibly made of animal skin, with 21 short phrases, written in the classical language. Each phrase describes a future event. Some of these have already come to pass, some are still in the future, and the very last one tells of the conclusion, not merely the end of a specific place or nation, but the conclusion of all things. The chronometer appeared sometime in the early part of the 20th century. It arrived without any accompanying text, left inside an envelope marked only with a single red stamp. There was no originating address, no date. The pigment was dry, the material appeared aged. Some dismissed it as a simple joke, others believed it was a dire warning. The first few phrases were easy to confirm. They mentioned historical occurrences that had already taken place, including one that described the demise of a specific pope in precise detail, using exact language that matched news headlines only days afterward. That was when the serious concern began to spread. One priest was selected to examine the document. He read the entire page slowly, translating each phrase with immense care. But after completing his task, he requested to be relieved of his duties. He never spoke of what the final phrases contained. Only once, shortly before his own death, he confided in an associate, "You must never read it twice. The second time is fundamentally different." No one understood what this meant. But years later, another academic was granted short-term access to the document. He was meticulous. He copied the contents by hand and compared his transcription to the official records from the first reading. And something was wrong. The middle phrases had been altered, not completely, but just enough to show variance. Names were substituted, Dates were adjusted. It was as if the document had self-edited. Since that time, the Vatican has sealed it off. The chronometer is kept in a small dark container beneath 3 distinct layers of security. A specific caution is written on the lid. Do not translate on more than one occasion. What remains most unsettling is the final sentence. No complete translation has ever been officially released, but small fragments have been leaked over time. One fragment reads, "When the chime is silenced and the celestial bodies are counted, the final doorway will open." No one truly knows what this signifies, but those who have been near the document say the stillness there is unparalleled. Not just an absence of sound, but an absolute finality. Whatever the document contains, it is not a prediction in the conventional sense. It functions as a temporal mirror. And once you examine it, time returns the gaze. In the quiet, remote areas of the Vatican, where the lamps burn low and voices are kept down, a question occasionally slips between people. It is not posed openly in official meetings or recorded in formal texts. It is the type of question that resides unspoken, waiting for an answer. Could one specific text permanently damage the Church? To most, this sounds absurd. The Church has persisted for centuries. It has endured conflicts, losses, betrayal, and even periods of silence. It has confronted scientific inquiry, logical thought, and organised revolt. Yet there are those men of serious scholarship and deep reflection who believe that words, if organised in a particular sequence, could achieve what armies could not. Among religious scholars, this idea is never voiced loudly. It is transferred like a small, protected flame from one person to another. They speak of it cautiously, with downcast eyes, with hearts full of doubt. They talk of a single volume, perhaps just one, that does not contain lies, but speaks a truth too difficult to endure, a truth that could entirely change people's fundamental perception of reality, a truth that could undermine faith, not by destroying it, but by showing it from a new and frightening perspective. One academic, in the year 1968, composed a private letter to a fellow professional. In it he stated, "There is a form of truth that does not simply adjust belief. It replaces it entirely, not with skepticism, but with something deeper and more challenging, something that cannot be reduced to a sermon." He never published those thoughts. The letter was found after his passing, folded inside a heavily used prayer book. So what exactly might such a text describe? Some suggest it may offer a radically different account of the beginning of creation, a narrative that conflicts with the book of Genesis but still carries the deep resonance of authenticity. Others think it may discuss the human spirit in a way that eliminates the necessity for rites, for penitence, for formal organisation. A truth that would not extinguish the divine, but would make it too immense for structures, too immediate for priests to serve as intermediaries. And what would be the consequence if people started to accept that? What would become of the cathedrals, the theological principles, the thousands of years of careful tradition passed down? Some argue the Church would adapt and evolve, as it has done previously. Others fear it would simply collapse. But perhaps the deepest apprehension is not about losing authority. Perhaps it is the fear of total irrelevance. If one volume narrates the entire story differently, and if that narrative feels more authentic than the established one, then what is the fate of everything constructed upon the established narrative? This is why the Vatican guards its rarest documents so meticulously. Not because it doubts the strength of religious faith, but because it is aware that faith is not a perfect shield against every single truth. Sometimes one simple page is sufficient to open a new pathway, and once that pathway is opened, nothing is ever precisely the same again. There was once a devotion spoken softly by clerics in the earliest moments of the day, before the bells sounded and before the light reached the high windows of the sanctuary. It was brief, just a few sentences, but those who recited it said it brought a deep peace to the soul, a feeling of suspended existence between two planes. And then, without notice, the devotion disappeared. No one issued an order for its removal. No formal notices were dispatched, no reason was provided. It simply vanished from the sacred texts, from the ritual, and even from the collective memory. In time, it was never mentioned at all. Only a few elderly priests recalled it, and they too learned not to speak its original words. But in the secluded shelves of the Vatican archives, a single page remains, worn along the edges, faded by time. It contains the exact phrases of the forgotten devotion. The ink is pale, but the rhythmic cadence is still discernible. Scholars who have seen it refer to it as the devotion that was deliberately erased. What could a simple devotion possibly contain that would be considered hazardous? That is the query many have posed. It did not invoke curses. It did not challenge the divine. It was gentle and quiet, speaking of illumination and authenticity, of the Spirit's journey beyond the boundaries of the known cosmos. But one phrase stands out, a single clause that is distinct from the others. It guides us not toward the institution of humanity, but toward the ultimate source that existed before all foundations. That phrase, some believe, is the reason the devotion was abolished. It does not deny the divine presence. It does not reject religious belief. But it gestures towards something beyond the visible structure of the Church itself, a domain or a consciousness that cannot be reached by passing through doorways or kneeling before objects of worship. A voice that summons from before the written record, before the traditions, before even the beginning of time. For hundreds of years, the Church has functioned as a guide, a source of light in the darkness. But this particular devotion suggests that the light source is not the illumination itself, only a mechanism designed to contain it. That particular concept, while appealing to some, is profoundly troubling to others. A Vatican memorandum from the year 1935 briefly refers to the devotion, labelling it the line that deviates too far. Another document, written in 1961, lists it among texts explicitly excluded from all future printings. Still, the words persist, securely locked away, hidden from the public. The devotion waits, not because it is wicked, but because it dares to articulate something few are ready to hear. That truth does not always require a mediator, that pure light does not always pass through coloured glass, and that sometimes the most potent devotion is the one that can no longer be vocalised, only quietly remembered and deeply felt. The concluding page of manuscript 451b Dolos is different from every other sheet in the Vatican records. It has been seen by only a very small number of people, each carefully chosen and each bound by absolute secrecy. Yet even behind those sealed lips, small fragments of its description have slowly found their way into quiet conversations within the Church. Pieces mentioned briefly, documented in private journals, or retained in focused meditation. No one discusses its full content, but those who have seen it say the last page is not constructed of paper or animal skin. It feels distinct, like something compressed from fine fibre and metal, yet it folds exactly as a page should. The ink is not black, but a deep shade of crimson, the colour of dried sealant or very old blood. It shimmers slightly, even in minimal light, and emits an odour not of age or decay, but something resembling wet stone after a storm. The written material on the page is minimal. Some report that there are only 7 complete lines. Others claim the phrases change when spoken aloud, never sounding exactly the same to any two listeners. The dialect is not entirely Latin, nor entirely Greek. It contains echoes of a much older form of communication, something that is not attributable to any single civilization or historical period. The final sentence is the most problematic. One academic, now long since deceased, described it in his personal writing. He recorded, "The last sentence does not conclude with an end mark. It concludes with a reflection." When I looked directly at it, I saw an image of myself, but significantly older and afraid. Another person who read it, a young theological student in the year 1972, fainted while examining the page. When asked what he had witnessed, he was unable to articulate a response. He withdrew from the church 3 months later and never returned. What could a single written page contain that would provoke such an intense reaction? Some believe it names an entity, not a specific person or location, but a reality too self-evident to be denied. A reality concerning what lies beyond mortal life or what underpins all religious belief. Others suggest the page contains no formal warning at all, only a query so perfectly articulated, so profound that it becomes impossible to disregard. Since it was last reviewed, the Vatican no longer opens the volume. It remains securely locked in a container lined with heavy metal and iron. A mark drawn in warm wax and consecrated with sacred oil holds the security seal. The room where it rests is monitored not by human guards, but by the stillness itself. Still, the final page waits patiently. Not to be dreaded, not even primarily to be read, but to remind the world that some truths do not require extensive wording. They require only one single page, a reflective surface at the end of a long dark passage, a single breath held forever in the stone. And when that page is examined again, if it is ever examined again, the world may not entirely cease to exist, but it will be irreversibly changed. For a very long time, people have spoken of manuscript 451b as if it were a curse of some kind, a text too dangerous to be opened, too bizarre to be intellectually grasped. Some suspected it caused physical ailments. Others feared it induced mental instability. A few even whispered that it opened pathways that should forever remain closed. But what if the volume is not a curse whatsoever? What if it is a mirror? In the veiled chambers deep beneath the Vatican, where the light is low and the air is stagnant, that hypothesis has gradually taken hold. A few meticulous scholars, those who have analysed the content without reading too extensively, have begun to hypothesize that the volume's true danger is not its capacity to inflict damage, but its profound capacity to reveal. Because a mirror does not modify the object it observes, it merely presents it. Those who read even a small portion of the manuscript often emerge fundamentally altered. Not because the volume forced something external into their minds, but because it extracted something internal. Quiet anxieties, unstated self-truths, the aspects of religious belief that feel too heavy to sustain. The obscure depths of the human spirit where existential questions reside without final answers. One priest wrote in a correspondence kept private since the year 1983, "The volume did not vocalize, it did not make threats, it simply gazed back at me, and for the very first time I saw my own self with true clarity." Others have described a comparable experience, reading a specific line and feeling an immediate certainty that they had always known it, despite never having encountered the information before. Seeing a particular symbol and feeling it shift, not on the physical page, but within their own inner consciousness. It is not supernatural, they assert. It is ancestral memory, a form of profound recollection that does not stem from formal education, but from something far older, as if the volume was not written with the intent to instruct, but rather to serve as a deep reminder. If that hypothesis is accurate, then its strength does not lie in sorcery or classified information. Its strength lies in absolute honesty, the kind of honesty that cannot be undone. And that may be the actual reason it remains securely locked away. Not because it misrepresents the facts, not even because it inspires terror, but because it shows too much of the internal reality. It reflects what people genuinely believe, what deeply frightens them, and what they secretly hope for. Without external judgment, without offering comfort, without any concealment. A curse is designed to break things apart, but a mirror merely exposes what was already fractured, so the Vatican maintains its closed status, resting in utter silence, not as a form of disciplinary measure, nor as an act of defence, but as a form of profound compassion. Because some truths are not meant to be widely proclaimed, some truths are meant to be confronted gently. And when the time is right, when someone inevitably opens the volume again, they will not discover terrifying mythical beings or burning fire. They will discover only themselves looking back at them. There is a specific chamber deep below the Vatican, past winding stone halls and solid wooden barriers where natural light is scarce and time seems to move in slow motion. Inside that chamber rests a container. It is not constructed from common wood or glass. It is entirely sealed in protective lead and cold iron, metallic to the touch and silent as a grave. Inside that container, it is said, resides the single volume no one is permitted to physically touch. Not anymore. The volume has no distinguishing title. It has no identifying name on its external binding. Those who have documented its existence use only a numerical identifier. Manuscript $451. It is discussed in hushed tones, even by those who dismiss the existence of magical curses. It is secured beneath multiple layers of protection, not because of the physical materials it is made from, but because of the spiritual content it might transmit. Not a contagious disease nor a toxin, but fundamental memory. The Church does not keep it hidden due to any animosity. It is not a book of evil content. It is a book of something else entirely. Something that cannot be easily articulated in formalized speeches or codified into religious doctrine. It is too ancient, too straightforward, and too connected to a core part of the human experience. Some claim it contains the authentic voice of pure truth. Others suggest it captures the distinct voice of the reader, played back in a manner that is impossible to forget. Over the years, a select few individuals have been permitted to view it briefly. Not to physically hold it, not to turn its pages, simply to observe it through a very thick glass panel in a room where even a single breath seems exceptionally loud. Each visitor has departed subtly altered, though not always permanently damaged. Some wept openly, some knelt in prayer. One individual simply walked away and never spoke another word. In the year 1979, a high-ranking cardinal formally requested that the manuscript be moved to a location with greater access to be fully studied again using modern scholarly techniques. His official request was rejected, not by a formal vote, but by a pervasive, quiet agreement. A silent voice that permeated the entire room and prevented anyone from speaking in opposition. The lead container has been consecrated multiple times, not just once, by holy fathers, by those who banish spirits, by people whose hands trembled as they performed this action. The tough outside casing is inscribed with emblems that are both ancient and unheard of. Not as ornamentation, but instead as a clear warning. This thing is not supposed to be opened unintentionally, or perhaps it is not meant to be opened under any circumstance. The atmosphere inside the room feels stifling. It carries the scent of beeswax and old dirt and rock. No lamps are kept burning in that place. No words of worship are ever spoken aloud. Only the scraping sound of footwear on worn-down flooring. Just the faint rhythm of a beating heart. Whenever an individual has the courage to approach the closed container, the manuscript held within makes no movement. It does not give off a light. Yet those who have been close to it claim it possesses a kind of life in its perfect stillness. Expecting something, observing, not to be handled, not yet. In the secluded areas of the Vatican's collection, where the fine dust never fully settles and the oil lamps give off little light, there is a query that seems to hang suspended in the still air. It is not etched onto the walls or voiced by the scholars who travel through, but it lingers, soft and constant, similar to the odour of aged parchment. Why do we feel dread about understanding? The Church has always been a safeguard of knowledge. It has reproduced, stored, and protected more written works than most entire nations. It has kept secure texts from forgotten eras, long after grand societies crumbled and cities became forgotten ground. Yet certain sheets are put away under lock and key. Some sentences are concealed behind heavy metal entries, not because they are lost entirely, but because they are not meant for human viewing. That is the origin of the fear. Knowledge on its own cannot speak. It does not travel around or issue commands, but it has the capacity to transform situations. It can alter how people perceive things, the manner in which they believe, the way they interpret the world around them. That is the source of its influence, and that is why it can seem threatening. A bound volume is not a blade, but it can cut deeply. A single phrase is not a fire, but it can destroy things people once held as certain. The Vatican holds numerous documents that were never distributed. Some were judged untrue, others confusing, and a few were simply too strange to be rationally explained. Among these kept secret writings are concepts that challenge what most individuals have always accepted as truth. Not outright deceptions, not clever tricks, simply different. And when something novel impacts the core of what is believed, it shakes more than just the mind. That is the thing the archive keeps in memory. One researcher, writing in the year 1928, suggested the most frightening piece of information is not the kind that proves something to be wrong. It is the type that feels like it might be entirely accurate. His personal notes were never put into print, but they remain within the collection, placed inside a thin folder no one reads anymore. The apprehension regarding knowledge is not a recent development. It traces back to the very first garden, to the forbidden fruit, to the deliberate choice, to the moment when being aware of something meant losing one's innocence. That story is not just a mere tale. It acts as a repeating theme, a caution, a reflection. Still, not every piece of information is meant to be feared outright. Some is meant to be confronted, even if slowly, even if quietly. And perhaps that explains why the collection does not destroy its most hazardous publications. It only conceals them in the hope that one day someone will be prepared. One day the deep stillness will be interrupted. And when that specific time arrives, the Church might waver, but it will not fall completely. It will acknowledge that truth is not the enemy of faith itself. It is merely the segment that has not yet been articulated. And until that time comes, the collection waits patiently with shelves full of written papers and chambers full of unanswered questions. In the deepest area of the Vatican's vast historical record, past doors that no longer function and stone steps that few individuals have climbed, there is one chamber that stays in perpetual darkness. It was once a place of silent occupation. The delicate flipping of pages, the scratching sound of writing tools, the deliberate pace of a man known only to a small inner circle. They referred to him simply as the Keeper. He had no official title, no workspace featuring golden trim or polished marble surfaces, yet within those cold stone boundaries, his viewpoint held significant authority. He had dedicated his service to the Church for close to 40 years, traversing the archive corridors like a person journeying through pure recollection itself. Every dawn he would light just one candle, not for the simple light, but as a statement of presence. He insisted it helped the books recall they had not been forgotten. The Keeper was entrusted with the most ancient materials, the most delicate, confidential matters, the things not intended for public vision or hearing. He did not chase after final answers, only a deeper understanding. He was convinced that even complete quiet held meaning if one paid attention long enough. In the year 1983, a subtle change occurred. That year, the Keeper asked for private time with manuscript 451b. His request was granted, but the rules were explicit. 60 minutes, absolutely no writing, no physical contact with the pages. Just pure looking. He entered the locked room carrying his small candle, as he always did, but this time he made no attempt to light it again. When his assistants returned to the chamber, they found the air cold and motionless. The candle had completely melted away, leaving behind only a small mark of old wax. The book had not been disturbed. The heavy iron container remained secured. But the Keeper was seated quietly in his assigned chair, his eyes closed softly, his face completely tranquil. He was no longer taking breaths. He had passed away without making any noise. There was no indication of distress, no look of agony, only deep composure, as if he had just finished examining something and had then drifted off to sleep. Next to him was a piece of paper that had been carefully folded. It contained only a single statement written in his neat and consistent handwriting. There exist words that put an end to all inquiries. No one could confidently say whether he had finished reading the last sheet or had simply gazed upon it. But following that specific day, the chamber was sealed off entirely. The candle never burned there again. It became known as the space permanently darkened. The Vatican did not arrange a public memorial service. No news reports were published about it. But inside the archive system, the keeper's name is still spoken softly with deep reverence, because he truly grasped something that most people will never achieve. That knowledge does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it appears in a total quietness, and sometimes a final wick is not the ending of illumination. It is merely the start of a profound quiet, the sort that holds fundamental truth carefully and waits patiently. The manuscript is still resting in that place, even now, located in the very deepest chamber of the Vatican's historical collection. Manuscript 451b has not been transported anywhere else. It continues to be sealed inside its enclosure made of heavy lead and metal, never reached by sunlight, protected by absolute silence. Dust accumulates on the surrounding surfaces, but never directly on the volume. Time appears to move much slower within that specific volume of space, as if the entire atmosphere is waiting with held breath. People occasionally wonder what happens to a bound book that nobody ever looks at. Does it simply rest? Does it wait for someone? Or does it actually listen to everything? Those individuals who have stood near it claim there is a strange quality in the atmosphere. Not feeling cold, not feeling warm, but intensely observant. As if the manuscript is aware that it has not been forgotten, as if it can recall the hands that have moved near it and the various eyes that have dared to study its outer covering. The Vatican institution refuses to talk about this matter. There are absolutely no available documents for general viewing. No assigned researchers are given the task of studying it. However, the correct key still exists somewhere, kept inside a heavy sealed container within a secure room known only to a very select few. And somewhere among that group, perhaps, is the next person who will read it. It might not be a religious figure, it might not be an academic, it could be someone very unassuming, someone nobody would predict. That is often how the Church operates. It conceals its most significant facts not in brightly lit areas, but in the quiet, undisturbed corners where patient waiting exists. The future reader may not be sent there to discover definitive answers. They may simply be instructed to merely observe the object. And if that day ever occurs, if the heavy container is finally opened and the page is turned over, the outside world might not sense the change right away. No great bells will begin to ring, no voices will rise in a cheer, but something essential will be altered, not in the sky, not in the ground beneath, but within the inner self of one single person, seated alone in that very quiet space, reading information that was absolutely never meant to be read on a second occasion. They suggest the manuscript does not tell you what you must accept as true. It does not provide detailed instructions. It neither offers a warning nor provides any comfort. It simply reveals things. It holds up a mirror image, poses a question, shows a gateway, and the person who flips the very last page will understand completely. Not with dread, not with happiness, but with that profound, hushed realization that only comes once within a lifetime. The Vatican has ensured the manuscript remained concealed for a logical reason, but such reasons are subject to change over time, and the future is constantly watching the past events, anticipating the moment when the silence will finally be broken. Until then, the manuscript remains motionless, unread, unopened, but never forgotten entirely. Because the narratives that possess the most power do not conclude, they simply wait. There is a specific narrative circulated quietly among those who have been employed inside the Vatican's historical records. It has not been written down in any form, not included in any official institutional report, but it has been handed down from one careful guardian to the next, always spoken in a lowered tone, as if speaking it too loudly might disturb something dormant in the darkness. The account starts with a specific visitor, a younger gentleman, reserved and formally dressed, who arrived at the Vatican grounds in the chilly winter season of 1997. He lacked any official designation, any public recognition, any powerful speaking voice. However, he came carrying official permission, formally signed and stamped, to investigate certain documents kept deep inside the archive. He specifically requested to view manuscript 4551b. The request was not approved immediately. Several days went by. Many inquiries were conducted. Then one evening, just before the scheduled time for closing the doors, he was escorted down into the lower level corridors by an elderly custodian whose specific identity is never mentioned. The man was aged, with very deliberate steps and eyes that seemed to have witnessed far too much. They did not exchange words on the trip downward, only the slight noise of their footwear hitting the stone surface. When they eventually reached the entrance of the sealed chamber, the custodian paused briefly outside the doorframe. He did not retrieve the appropriate key. He simply turned around, met the young man's gaze directly, and posed one hushed query. "Do you truly still wish to know?" It was not intended as a warning, nor as any kind of threat, only a genuine question, simple and expressed clearly. But it contained the entire significance of everything lying behind that very heavy door. Every single sheet, every single identity, every single breath that had ever been drawn in the close proximity of that single manuscript. The visitor did not offer an answer. He simply turned around and proceeded to depart. No verbal explanation was given, no farewell was exchanged. He returned to his own home country the following day and never once came back to the Vatican. No one knows what ultimately led him to change his mind so quickly. Perhaps the pervasive silence was sufficient reason. Perhaps the direct look in the custodian's eyes conveyed all the information he needed to grasp. What holds importance is the question itself, because those 5 words now resonate throughout the vast archive like the concluding line from a prayer long forgotten. Do you truly still wish to know? It is a demanding question for the naturally inquisitive, for the truly brave souls, for those individuals who seek fundamental truth even when it might not provide comfort, and for those who believe that greater understanding is always a helpful resource. But not every single helpful resource is easy to endure. Some hard truths do not bring forth inner peace. Some difficult questions do not have definitive answers. And some heavy doors, once swung open, can never be fully closed again. The elderly custodian passed away not long afterward. His given name was never officially recorded in any official documentation, but his words remain, quietly transferred to those who follow in his duties, a sober reminder that the final movement toward highly restricted knowledge is not the turning of a lock or the simple opening of a physical page. It is the core decision itself. Do you truly still wish to know? When people walk across the impressive main corridors of St. Peter's Basilica, their gaze often shifts upward. They admire the towering dome structure, the artistically painted ceilings, the sacred altars adorned with gold, but very few individuals ever remember to direct their attention downward. Even fewer wonder what lies far beneath the solid ground where they stand. Underneath all the polished marble, beneath the sacred altars and various chapels, below the stone tombs and the ancient bones of holy figures, there is something entirely different, a place containing books. It is not accurately marked on the majority of existing architectural maps. Tourists do not encounter instructional signs pointing them toward it. But it genuinely exists, carefully hidden deep underneath the Vatican City, carved into solid rock and enduring time. Some people choose to call it a strong box. Others refer to it as a protected chamber. But those few who fully grasp its core function understand it acts as a kind of structural base, not composed of typical stones, but rather of lasting memories. St. Peter's was intentionally constructed as a potent symbol of deep faith, immense power and visible grandeur. But long before its imposing exterior walls reached into the sky, the church organization was already steadily collecting something else entirely. Written words, detailed accounts, challenging inquiries, all the collected fragments of human thought that were deemed unfit for general public viewing. These items were carefully stored far below the ground, in an area where natural light never penetrates and where the intense quietness feels profoundly ancient. The manuscripts kept in this location are unlike those encountered anywhere else in the world. They are not systematically organized by subject category or publication year. Some are carefully enveloped in protective fabric, others are fully secured inside solid storage containers. Many possess no written title whatsoever, but each one contains something that held significant meaning for one specific person. A concept once fully expressed, a genuine truth once highly feared, a sacred vow never intended to be fully heard by human ears. One of the earliest priests to navigate those cramped tunnels, back in the year 1614, referred to it as the secondary church beneath the primary church structure. He recorded that it was constructed not for the physical body, but specifically for the human spirit. A protected location where unresolved questions could peacefully reside, completely unaffected by the passage of time. Even today, only a handful of approved individuals are permitted to gain entry. They move very quietly, speak in low whispers, and are careful not to remain there for very long. There are no external openings, only small oil lanterns and the persistent sensation that the very stone walls themselves are actively listening. It is commonly believed that manuscript 451b was, at one time, kept in this very place, before it was relocated to a higher, more secure vault for even greater safeguarding. Some people suggest the manuscript's enduring presence permanently altered the spatial dynamics around it. It made the hard stones feel colder, the intense silence even more profound. Whether that claim is entirely accurate or not, the distinct atmosphere remains palpable. To walk across the upper level of St. Peter's is to rely on more than just religious faith. It is to be standing directly upon stories too unusual to ever be repeated, deep truths too difficult to speak openly. The basilica structure may shine brightly with golden ornamentation and visible light. However, its supporting core extends deeply into the surrounding darkness, and within those deep shadows, the church maintains its most highly guarded facts. Because even the strongest external boundaries require a much deeper foundational support, not one built of simple rock, but one built of absolute silence. Some people claim that after someone examines the most restricted written material in the Vatican, the inscribed words do not simply leave the conscious mind. They remain quietly present, not like a simple recollection, but more closely resembling a nocturnal vision, a faint whisper that infiltrates sleep, communicating in a distinct language that most people have long since forgotten how to speak, Latin. It is the language of the church institution, of age-old prayers, of chanted sacred musical pieces. But within this particular manuscript, the Latin feels different entirely. It does not possess a rhythmic quality. It offers no sense of peace. It just stubbornly lingers. Odd phrases once spoken that continue to echo long after the pages have been carefully closed and secured. A young research academic once stated that after having seen manuscript 451b, he started to have dreams composed of words he could not possibly comprehend. He had only seen the protective cover and had not physically touched a single sheet of paper, but still he would wake up with lines of complex Latin phrases on his lips. The phrases were short, fragmented and difficult to place accurately. Yet when he meticulously researched them, they always pointed directly to something undeniably real, something profoundly ancient. One such phrase kept returning repeatedly: Veritas ardet, sed non consumit. The fundamental truth burns the observer but does not actually destroy them. Another visitor, a serving priest in the year 1971, asserted that after reading only one full line from the highly secretive manuscript, he was completely unable to sleep at all. For 3 entire nights, he heard the phrase being repeated constantly, not through his ears, but originating from somewhere much deeper within him. Oculus in speculo videtae. The viewing eye in the reflective surface sees you completely. The Church never officially confirmed what specific language fills the pages of the manuscript. Some suggest it is a form of Latin blended with something far more ancient. Others are convinced it is not the actual language that grants the text its immense power, but rather the unique construction of the phrases, the deep rhythm of the underlying meaning, like a musical composition only partially remembered, perpetually on the very edge of conscious thought. A careful custodian once discovered a small folded message left behind by a former reader who had since passed away. It was written in unsteady handwriting, and the ink used had almost completely disappeared. Noli tangea verbum ultimum. Do not physically touch the final inscribed word. That concise phrase eventually became a consistent part of the archive's unique folklore, not out of any simple fear, but specifically due to intense curiosity. What precisely was the final word? What was so highly dangerous about it that the reader felt compelled to leave such a powerful warning behind? No one has a conclusive answer, and still the Latin words persist in dreams, in profoundly quiet corners, within the silent gap between deep sleep and fully waking up. Simple words echoing silently in the mind like soft footfalls descending an unending corridor. Not every single person hears them, but those who do are fundamentally changed forever. Because some words are not merely written down to be superficially read. They are written specifically to remain firmly imprinted. Truth within the Vatican institution is not always a simple, easily defined concept. It is not just what is officially written in the numerous bound volumes or intricately carved into the marble walls. It is also inherently found in what remains unstated, in the quiet, empty spaces between all the words, in the deliberate decisions regarding what information to retain and what information to fully conceal. The extensive archives contain countless factual pieces, but they do not all communicate in the same manner or tone. Some are entirely clear and openly accessible, while others are tightly encased in profound mystery, waiting patiently for a specific person to look much closer. Mystery is just as significant a component of the Vatican as faith itself is. It moves subtly through the lengthy corridors and carefully settles into the various chambers where the artificial light is purposefully dimmed and the air smells distinctly of aging paper materials. It resides permanently in the secured drawers, in the sealed paper envelopes, and inside the bound volumes that have remained completely unopened for many hundreds of years. Some mysteries are quite minor, such as a missing single sheet from an official letter. Others are so overwhelmingly large that even their accepted titles are never formally written down anywhere. These represent the specific mysteries that leave a person questioning whether the truth is actually being protected, or if it is being actively kept hidden from everyone. Memory holds both factual truth and complex mystery intertwined. The entire Vatican structure is built upon the foundation of collective memory, the memory of deep faith, of shared history, of critical decisions made during moments of intense fear or profound optimism. Every single chamber, every single shelf, every single piece of paper material is one fragment of that immense memory. Some memories are widely celebrated, openly displayed for any person to view. Others are buried deeply, permanently stored away, as if the passing of time might eventually soften their harsh edges. But collective memory does not always simply vanish just because it has been deliberately hidden away. Sometimes it grows significantly sharper in the surrounding darkness. Inside the archival collections, you can clearly sense these three distinct concepts actively pressing against one another. Truth deeply desires to be fully visible. Mystery strongly seeks to be permanently protected. Memory urgently wishes to be entirely preserved. They operate like three separate threads meticulously woven into the same continuous fabric, making it nearly impossible to pull them apart without completely altering the inherent pattern. This is precisely why the Vatican carefully guards what it chooses to guard so strictly. It is not always solely about maintaining institutional power. Sometimes it truly concerns the sheer overwhelming burden of being aware of too much information too prematurely, or about the specific dread of what specific consequences might arise if certain crucial truths were openly spoken to the masses. Some individuals passionately argue that truth should never, under any circumstances, be hidden. Others genuinely believe it should only be fully revealed when the timing is perfectly appropriate. The Vatican carefully navigates between these two opposing ideas, holding on to its most prized treasures and its unsettling shadows using the exact same hands. There exist undeniable truths within those locked rooms that possess the potential to completely change how all of recorded history is currently viewed. There are profound mysteries that possess the potential to open up completely new sets of questions that will likely never be resolved. And there are collected memories, both moments of pride and moments of deep regret, that serve to remind everyone that the past is never quite as far away as it might seem to be. In the final analysis, the Vatican's exhaustive archives are not only about physical books and various letters. They are fundamentally about the extremely delicate balance between full disclosure and careful safeguarding, between actively remembering and intentionally forgetting, between what is firmly established as known and what will always remain permanently, just out of meaningful reach. And somewhere within that critical equilibrium lies the central narrative of the Church institution itself. History does not simply stay confined to the past. It persistently lingers like a pervasive shadow that stretches itself far beyond the precise moment when the sun has finally disappeared below the horizon. Within the Vatican grounds, this persistent shadow is notably lengthy and extremely deep. It moves silently throughout the expansive marble halls and along the rigid stone pathways, carried forward by old institutional decisions and the lost voices of the past. Some small portion of it is composed of pure light, containing the inspiring memories of revered saints, genuine acts of charity, and impactful words that permanently shifted the entire world. But a significant portion of it is darker still, specifically shaped by complex choices that are not openly recorded in official public histories. Every single bound volume within the Vatican archives represents one small piece of that extensive shadow. Some pages recount detailed stories of unwavering faith and immense personal courage. Others carefully hold specific records of deep fear, regrettable errors, and hidden organizational secrets. Taken together, they collectively construct a complex picture that is simply too vast to be entirely absorbed at one time. The Church institution has consistently served as an unwavering keeper of historical events, but being a meticulous keeper of history also automatically requires shouldering its accompanying weight. Once a defining choice has been permanently made, it cannot possibly be entirely reversed. The lingering shadow remains firmly cast. Regardless of how many subsequent years pass by, there are specific instances when this persistent shadow feels much heavier than the actual structural walls that contain it. A specific letter that was never deliberately sent out during an intense time of crisis. A unique manuscript intentionally hidden because its contents were judged to be overtly dangerous. A formal record locked permanently away because its eventual public disclosure might trigger challenging questions that no one is yet prepared to adequately address. These foundational choices do not simply vanish completely with the passage of time. Instead, they actively follow along, silently and persistently, waiting for a specific person to open the appropriate door and permit them to return fully into the light. The Vatican fully understands this reality. It has witnessed firsthand how the past can often re-emerge when it is least anticipated. An old forgotten document can suddenly surface unexpectedly and completely change how a long-held story is authentically conveyed. A private, personal letter can reveal a painful truth that was never originally intended to become public knowledge. And sometimes, even the simple absence of communication can be remembered just as powerfully as a highly publicized speech. History is not exclusively created by what specific actions people actually take. It is also equally created by the important decisions they consciously choose not to take at all. In this fundamental sense, the encompassing shadow is not an antagonistic force. It is instead a crucial reminder. It vividly demonstrates that history is never truly concluded, that every single moment remains intricately connected to all that has come before it. The specific choices being made in the present day will inevitably become tomorrow's subsequent shadow, carefully extending itself outward for future generations to clearly observe. The Vatican's historical collections contain multiple centuries of these precise connections, tightly linking the past era to the current era in intricate ways that are simultaneously both inspiring and deeply unsettling. Some sections of the shadow are extremely distinct, having been cast by highly well-known, widely publicized historical events. Others are far more challenging to accurately perceive, cleverly hidden behind countless layers of accumulated time and intentional secrecy. But all of them significantly shape the way the Church is ultimately perceived and remembered by the world. And all of them serve as a constant reminder to us that the past cannot be perpetually locked away forever. Even within the most heavily guarded physical rooms, history patiently waits for its moment. In the profound silence of the Vatican environment, one can almost sense it fully. The strong, pervasive presence of significant things that have not been forgotten at all, even though they have been systematically concealed. The persistent shadow of history simply refuses to disappear. It walks steadily alongside the present moment, constantly reminding us that absolutely nothing is ever truly permanently gone. It patiently waits for the precise moment when it will step fully forward once more. And when that time eventually arrives, it will speak in a distinct voice that manages to sound both incredibly ancient and brand new all at once. If the elusive manuscript truly exists, it represents much more than mere paper materials and applied ink. It is an overwhelming presence, a serious burden that would entirely change the fundamental way people approach and think about historical events, religious faith, and ultimate truth itself. For many centuries, quiet rumours have persistently suggested that deep within the vast Vatican complex there resides one single, unique volume unlike any other known text. No verifiable origin, no credited creator, no public record confirming its existence. The story surrounding it has been passed along piece by piece, travelling from keepers of records to academics, from experts to those who listen carefully, until it became less of a simple item and more of an unanswered query. If the object is genuine, why was it saved? Most texts considered dangerous are typically destroyed. Fire and the passage of centuries have wiped out innumerable documents that once caused problems for the Church. Yet this particular one, it is said, was protected, sealed away, and concealed with greater care than any valuable relic. The deliberate choice not to eliminate it is exactly what gives the mystery such strength. To safeguard something so dreaded means it must possess a certain kind of consequence, even if that consequence is harmful. Some suggest it holds writings predating the Church's foundation. Others assert it contains knowledge of happenings that have not yet transpired. A few maintain that it is not one continuous narrative, but many, woven together from the testimony of prophets, dissenters, and people who witnessed things they could never rationally explain. The descriptions of it are never consistent, and perhaps that is because certainty is impossible. Those who claim to have laid eyes on it often communicate in enigmas, as if revealing too much detail would invite trouble to their doorstep. If this item truly exists, then the Vatican's policy of silence represents more than mere confidentiality. It is a calculated move, a determination that the world is unprepared, or will forever be unprepared, to receive the book's message. But secrecy does not eliminate fascination. It fuels it. Every locked entrance, every missing document, every quiet warning makes the investigation feel more immediate. There is also the underlying concern, fear that the book could be misinterpreted, fear that it could be used to inflict damage, fear that belief could be damaged if its pages were opened without extreme caution. These apprehensions are not noted in official documents, but they reside in the attitude of those who discuss the object. They are present in the hesitations, in the quick looks over the shoulder, in the precise language used. If the book is real, then it has endured conflict, theft, and eras of transition. It has been handled by people who grasped its significance and chose to keep it hidden. This implies it is not just a piece of history. It is a survivor of it. And if one day it is located, if the mechanisms turn, if the contents are viewed by eyes beyond the Vatican's boundary, then the question will no longer be about its presence. The question will focus on what follows, because some openings once made can never be closed again, and some statements once read will remain part of human knowledge permanently. The Vatican possesses many forms of authority, but only one remains invisible. It is not composed of precious metal, not worn on the head of a pontiff, and not paraded through public squares. This hidden authority is older than all the visible ones, forged not from minerals or gems, but from three subtle concepts: truth, the unknown, and remembrance. These form the foundation that supports the Church, concealed beneath every stone and echoing through every corridor. Truth is what the Church claims to preserve. It is inscribed in holy texts, delivered from the pulpit, and studied across the globe. But truth is not always simple. It does not always remain stationary. It evolves, shifts, and occasionally startles even those convinced they understand it completely. Within the Vatican, there are spaces filled with revelations yet to be shared. Correspondence from the past, texts never published, records of choices made discreetly. Some facts were kept concealed not because they were false, but because their burden was too great. Not every truth offers comfort. Some truths illuminate areas of past missteps the Church would prefer to overlook. But the illumination persists. Then there is the unknown. The unknown is the essential quality of faith. It is what drives people to kneel, to look heavenward, and to contemplate. It is the silence separating ideas, the distance between inquiries. The Vatican is constructed on layers of the unknown, of miracles, of spiritual experiences, of stories handed down through time. But there are different forms of the unknown as well. Secret writings, erased identities, entrances that no longer function. Manuscript 451b belongs to this group, not simply because of its content, but because of what it withholds. Its quietness becomes a statement. And finally, remembrance. Remembrance is the vital core of the Church. Without it, belief lacks stability. The Vatican ensures remembrance endures not just through worship and ceremony, but through the documents it commits to protecting. Deep within the archives are memories of terror, aspiration, devotion, and regret. Of sacred figures and heretics, of rulers and captives, of the courageous and the overlooked. Even the darkest episodes of its history are preserved here, though not always mentioned aloud. Remembrance does not always require a loud proclamation. Sometimes it only needs to be kept secure until someone is prepared to carry its weight once more. Together, truth, the unknown, and remembrance constitute the invisible authority. They are not held by a single person. They are carried forward by time. And although most people will never walk within the archive's walls or handle its books, the narratives contained inside still reach us in visions, in stillness, in inquiries voiced just before sleep. The Vatican's triple authority does not shine brightly in daylight, but it emits a soft light in the dark, and it constantly anticipates the next person willing to listen. Even in the most prominent areas of the Vatican, the past accompanies the present. It does not demand attention, it does not raise its voice, but it is always there, like a faint shape on the masonry, soft, constant, and impossible to disregard. History does not remain buried, not in a location where every section of wall, every pathway, every locked access point holds a memory. The Vatican is frequently described as enduring, but time operates beneath its surface in undetectable ways. Correspondence that was suppressed resurfaces. Forgotten books are located behind aging shelves. Voices, long believed silenced, return in subconscious thoughts or faint auditory effects. There are narratives that re-emerge without warning, a small sheet of paper discovered during repairs, a message placed inside the cover of a volume, a marking etched into the base of a stair. Each one signals something once set aside, now stepping back into awareness. A workman in 1968, assisting with preservation in the archive, found a brick that felt loose. Behind it was a rolled piece of animal skin sealed with wax. No name, no date, just a short Latin sentence. When translated, it read, "It was never lost, merely concealed." That phrase became an unspoken understanding among the caretakers, because the past is not dormant forever. Even manuscript 451b, despite being secured, is not forgotten. People continue to inquire about it. Scholars remain perplexed. Some religious figures, although instructed not to utter its designation, still feel compelled toward the area where it is housed. Something about it resonates, not forcefully, but distinctly. That is the fundamental nature of history. Even when we attempt to suppress it, it finds a way back through small openings and quiet moments. There are artworks in the Vatican that were once coated over, only to be uncovered centuries later. There are burial sites, once thought empty, now found to hold secrets beneath the rock. And there are inquiries, once posed in fear, that now resurface from curiosity. Why do we keep aspects of the past hidden? Sometimes to shield others, sometimes to shield ourselves. But regardless of the rationale, the truth persists. The shadow waits, and when the illumination changes just enough, it reappears. The Vatican has kept numerous items secured, some for security, some for influence, some because the general public was not prepared to comprehend them, but the past is patient. It does not need to aggressively announce itself. It only requires time. And, in an institution like this, time is pervasive. So even as the Church advances, constructing, educating, worshipping, the reflection of history trails behind, step for step. Not to frighten, not to condemn, but simply to provide a reminder. Nothing remains buried permanently, especially not the truth. If a single document like manuscript 451b can exist, then a subtle question starts to take shape in the back of one's mind. If this was hidden with such deliberation, guarded with such attention and secured so thoroughly, then what else might be lying in wait behind the Vatican's facades? That single notion can disrupt a person's sleep. The Church has accumulated information for more than 2,000 years. It has copied long scripts by the light of lamps, sealed communications with resin, and stored pages in chambers no one enters any longer. Each era introduced new narratives, new concerns, and new justifications for suppressing specific materials. texts with unusual markings, records from individuals considered heretics, accounts of supernatural occurrences, divine revelations, and incidents that defied simple understanding. And only a limited number of individuals know precisely where to search. Manuscript 451b is merely one small aperture in a passageway filled with secured entryways. It might be the most dreaded, the most discussed in hushed tones, but it is not unique. There are containers in the archive without identifying labels, storage units with malfunctioning mechanisms that no one risks repairing, volumes wrapped in crimson fabric, kept in compartments lined with dense metal. Some are sealed closed not to prevent access but to contain something within. A clergyman once remarked, "You cannot indefinitely contain truth, you can only delay its appearance." If the Church undertook such extraordinary measures to conceal one document, it is plausible they may have done it repeatedly. Some believe there are ancient scrolls from the earliest phases of the Christian faith, never decoded, composed in languages no longer spoken. Others suggest there are alternative accounts that detail parts of Jesus' existence not included in the standard scripture. There are rumours of writings authored by martyred figures while imprisoned, and even sheets from ancient places of worship long preceding the existence of Rome. There is even one specific tale, circulated softly, that somewhere within the Vatican resides a document originating not from the past but from the future. A text that does not record what has happened but anticipates it. A sequence of events too unsettling to communicate, one that people look at only once. No one knows whether these tales are accurate, but then again, no one knew for certain about manuscript 451b either, until confirmation emerged. And that is the central point of the unknown. For every secret that is uncovered, 10 more await just beyond it. Every revelation of fact leads to another secured chamber, another forgotten name, another faint impression on the written material. If this document is authentic, then perhaps the most impactful narratives in the Vatican have yet to be discovered. Perhaps they are waiting patiently for the appropriate observers, for the suitable handlers, and for the exact moment when silence finally gives way to understanding. Thank you for remaining with us until the conclusion. If any part of this undisclosed narrative caused you to pause, contemplate, or feel the attraction of an unresolved unknown, we would appreciate knowing what resonated with you. Share a quiet reflection in the area below. And if you have not already, please remember to subscribe and click the notification icon so you never miss another exploration into the obscure corners of history. Until our next discussion, maintain your curiosity, stay thoughtful, and sleep well.